This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, looking at these markets, the S&P 500 is up about almost 0.5%. The Dow's up about 0.1%. The Nasdaq's up about 0.4%. So broadly, some green on the screen here. Yields also slightly higher. The 10-year up about 4 basis points, 3.95%. Still more movement here in the energy markets due to some of that uncertainty in the Middle East. WTI crude oil up 2.5%, $73.23. And Bitcoin's off 1%, 41,450 on Bitcoin. Right now, let's head down to Washington, D.C. We got world and national news with Amy Morris.
All right, thanks, Paul. Thousands of people are without water. Hundreds of communities along the East Coast dealing with standing water and flooding after that deluge overnight and early this morning. Bloomberg meteorologist Rob Carolyn says the rain has moved on. The winds, though, those are just getting started.
Problem will continue to be winds through the afternoon. Wind advisory in effect for southern New England through 7 p.m. this evening. We'll see some gusts in the New York City area over 30 miles an hour this afternoon. Boston, though, could see some gusts over 45 miles an hour. Washington, D.C., some breaks of sunshine through the afternoon. It will be breezy in the district in Baltimore. Some gusts over 30 miles an hour are possible.
Flood warnings and watches reach from Maine to North Carolina. President Biden's approval rating is at an all-time low. The latest Monmouth University poll shows 34% approve of Biden's job performance. More than two-thirds of Americans disapprove of how Biden has handled inflation and immigration. Biden's campaign has ramped up efforts to reverse his low ratings by highlighting his economic record. The Senate is putting its holiday break on hold to try to reach a deal on Ukraine aid tied to tougher border policies. Bloomberg government's Zach Cohen reports the negotiations are still proving difficult.
There were a couple of Democrats from the White House and in Congress who were wondering aloud where there are some members that are looking for a position that are so strict that there is no bipartisan solution, and it's really just a way to prevent sending more aid to Kyiv.
Bloomberg government's Zach Cohen in the nation's capital, and a joint intelligence bulletin from the Department of Homeland Security, FBI, and the National Counterterrorism Center warns of an elevated threat of an attack targeting public gatherings through the holidays. CBS News is reporting that the threat is likely being amplified by ongoing tensions related to the conflict between Israel and Hamas. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris, and this is Bloomberg. Paul and Jess.
All right, Amy Morris, thank you so much. We appreciate it. So did the storm affect your long commute?
Long, are you?
How many
sarcasm
blocks,
there?
How many blocks do you walk?
Cross through the park on the west side to get
okay.
to the east
Okay.
side. But that was my goal in life, just to be able to walk to my office, because after living in New York for over a decade, it was always kind of like over the river, through the woods,
Right.
whether I was in Jersey and Brooklyn. So it makes it a little bit easier. But the storm, I was fortunate, did not knock out my electricity, but unfortunately for others, it did. So there's this blockbuster storm, as you know, Paul, tearing up the East Coast right now that has already knocked out power to hundreds of thousands of customers and grounded hundreds of flights, promising to bring flooding rain and, unfortunately, dangerous winds through today.
Yeah, and the heaviest rains will likely fall across eastern New York and western Massachusetts, which is with as much as 5 inches hitting the ground, said Rob Carolyn. He's the owner of Hometown Forecast Services, which provides forecasts to Bloomberg Radio.
That's right. So looking at NYC receiving about 1.5 inches of rain since midnight and could get another 1 to 2 inches throughout today, and that's according to a forecaster for Weather Prediction Center there. So flood warnings and watches reaching from Maine to North Carolina for the storm that already drenched Florida and Charleston, South Carolina.
Yeah, I saw the storms kind of starting in Florida and just went right up the coast. So everybody's kind of getting hit on the East Coast.
That's right.
Impacted my good friends at New Jersey Transit this morning. Our train was a little delayed. They had some.
Still made it in though.
Still made it in, but they had some delays. But got us in here, so that's
right.
that's
the
Monday.
Good.
That's the good news. So hopefully get this storm out of the way, so it won't impact too many people's
right.
holiday travel plans, because it's just all.
That's coming up quick.
Yes, exactly right. So so a big storm ripping through here the New York metropolitan area last night and this morning. Hopefully it'll blow out of here soon and get out of there. Just looking at the markets real quick as we approach noon Wall Street time. The S&P 500 is up about 0.5%. The Nasdaq's up about 0.4%. So a little bit of green on the screen here. Still trying to gauge where this Federal Reserve will go next. We'll have more coming up. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller.
Why were the economists so wrong? What are the economists getting wrong?
Isn't this a slam dunk time to buy U.S. Treasuries?
Soft landing, hard landing, no landing? I don't know.
True. What the heck does that mean?
I don't know.
Breaking market news and insight from Bloomberg experts.
We're going to be in an environment with higher rates for longer.
The 5-day in-office work week is effectively dead.
It's definitely a good sign that we're not ready to land this economy just yet.
This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, coming up in this hour, we're going to look at the global energy space. We're seeing oil firm here in the last couple of days, heightened geopolitical risk in the Middle East, putting a little bit of floor under oil. We'll check in with Bloomberg Intelligence, Fernando Valle. He is the senior analyst covering the global energy space. Then real estate chat. Selma Hepp, chief economist for CoreLogic, is going to discuss her outlook for real estate in the U.S. in 2024. And Wendy Whitmore, senior vice president and head of Palo Alto Network's cybersecurity team, continues to be a huge risk for corporate America and for individuals as well. So we'll get the latest there. Let's kick things off with Mr. Charlie Pellet.
Hi, thank you very much, Paul Sweeney. You mentioned crude oil. We begin there. West Texas Intermediate crude now rallying 2.6%, 73.32 a barrel. And Brent, the global benchmark at 78.59, barrel of Brent, up now by about 2.7%. Bottom line here, we have got the Dow, S&P, NASDAQ 100 index, all advancing. Russell 2000 kicking off the new week with a loss. So right now, that index down by about half a point. But here's where we stand, very close to the best level of the day. And this is after 7 weeks of gains for the U.S. stock market. S&P right now up 22. Gain there of 0.5%. Dow Industrials up 60. Up by about 0.2%. The NASDAQ Composite Index is up 65 right now, up by 0.4%. 10-year yield 3.95% with a 2-year that's yielding 4.45%. Gold up 0.1%. 22 for an ounce of the precious metal. Well, as for the overall market backdrop heading into the new year, Scott Cronert is U.S. equity strategist at Citigroup Global Markets, and he was the guest this morning on surveillance.
So going in 24, what we're arguing for broadening is part of our view that the S&P can hit 5,100 by the end of next year. And the view very simply has been that the market cannot move materially higher on the Big Seven alone. Essentially what you need is the rest of the weighting that comprises the index to participate.
He mentioned 5,100 on the S&P right now, 47.42 to put that call in context. S&P today up by 0.5%. By the way, you can hear more of that conversation on the Surveillance podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcasts. Apple will stop selling the Watch Series 9 and Ultra 2 in the U.S. just before Christmas as a result of a patent dispute over the blood oxygen sensor. And struggling apparel and footwear maker VF Corp says it is working to restore its ability to fulfill orders following a cyber attack, but the company has not yet determined the full scope of the incident. Shares of VFC, the old Vanity Fair Corp, lower now by 7.6%. Again, recapping, stocks higher, S&P up 22, gain there of 0.5%. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Charlie, I heard you saw the Queen of Pop over the weekend.
Unbelievable. Saturday night.
Madonna.
Madonna. She started an hour and 45 minutes late in Brooklyn. Don't get me going on that. I knew that ahead of time. My wife and I, when it's an 8:30 start in theory, we showed up at 9:15 figuring, hey, maybe she'll come out. Didn't take the stage till 10:15. That said, absolutely amazing. She continues to reinvent herself, looking back at 4 decades. Just an amazing adventure. Love Madonna.
What's your favorite song?
It has to be Like a Virgin, Borderline. I mean, I go way back, classic, but I tell you, Ray of Light was good stuff too. And she also did, she talked very openly, very honestly about her illness this past summer. And I will paraphrase because she didn't use words I can use, but she said it was just blank amazing that she was there after all that she went through. But she did an acoustic guitar version of I Will Survive. Who would have thought?
Nice.
I love that.
Charlie Pellet with a Madonna review. Before there was Taylor Swift, there was Madonna.
And
That's
you
right.
know, though, Paul, before that, there was Cher way back when. You know, I mean, we can go way back if you really want to. Sounding like Dave Wilson here.
I know Paul's a Madonna fan. What's your favorite song?
Fan. Oh, I don't know if I have one, but I mean, I definitely admire her business, how she just totally took complete ownership of her business.
I love it.
30, 40
What a
years ago, at a
queen.
time when women,
That's right.
individuals didn't do it at all,
Yes.
much less women.
And Paul, you know, there are some people that say Madonna is difficult to work with. No, she is a consummate perfectionist who gets the job done.
She wants to get it right.
And she, totally wants to get it right. And not only that, anytime anybody has ever told her no for whatever reason, she shows them the way it can be done, the way it should be done, and she gets it done.
All right, very good. There you go. That is a ringing endorsement for her Madonna and her show.
What a way to kick off the 12 o'clock hour, our
exactly.
final hour, guys. Here we go.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. We appreciate it. Looking at the markets, hey, we've got some green on the screen. Let's check in with Carmen Reinecke. She's an equities reporter for Bloomberg News. She joins us here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. Carmen, what are you looking at in the market?
Yeah, so I'm looking at a lot of red, actually, even though we're seeing green on the screen. First one I'm looking at is Structure Therapeutics, ticker GPCR. Shares are down about 36% right now after the company showed in the trial data that its experimental weight loss pill is not as effective as a similar product in development by Eli Lilly & Co. This is all about, you know, this booming weight loss market that everyone is super excited about. So falling short of Eli and Lilly, you know, a big deal here for Structure. And this is even, you know, after the company had some kind of positive data. You know, its pill was generally well tolerated by participants, which is important after Pfizer just had to pull a similar product because, you know, people were having adverse side effects. So shares of Structure are still up more than 100% year to date, but, you know, really falling. It's a record drop for them today on this news. The next ticker I'm looking at is EBIX, EBIX, and shares are down 69% today. The insurance software firm filed for bankruptcy after being unable to recover from the impacts of high interest rates and upcoming debt payments. It's a story, you know, we've heard before. This is a major win for short seller Hindenburg Research, which had called out, it had called out EBIX, previously accused the company of fabricating some of its revenue, including its gift card business, which EBIX denied. In bankruptcy, the company plans to sell its North American life insurance and annuity assets to help pay off that debt.
Wow, that's brutal, but good for Hindenburg.
Yeah, also a record drop there today. And yeah, a string of some good names for Hindenburg. The next one I'm looking at is Farfetch. If you want to get into the luxury fashion space, shares are down 13% right now. The company secured a $500 million line from Coupang, a South Korean company, which agreed to lend the e-commerce platform the money, buy its assets, and delist its shares. So Farfetch has really slumped this year. It's down more than 90%. Existing shareholders will be really wiped out by this deal, and it also means that it's no longer going to go forward with the deal that it had sort of rolling potentially with the owner of Cartier. So, you know, a big slump here for Farfetch. This was one of those stocks that really ran up during the pandemic when everyone was at home. They had some extra money to spend on luxury goods. And then, you know, as we've seen consumers sort of shift to, you know, experiences and travel, it's just not done so well. And it's really struggled to sort of, you know, stay in vogue, I guess. The last one I'm looking at today is SunPower, ticker SPWR. It's down almost 40% today. The company said that there is substantial doubt about its ability to continue operating. One of its subsidiaries defaulted under its credit agreement today due to a delay in third quarter financial statements. So basically, if the lenders demand immediate repayment, the company won't have enough liquidity to meet its obligations and pay its liabilities. So they are in touch with their lenders, but there's no assurance that there will be any waiver for SunPower.
Yeah, you also had a story that ran on the terminal yesterday. Floundering wheat stocks test Wall Street's faith in a 2024 rebound. What's going on there?
It's not been a great year for pot stocks. So this is an industry that had like a huge run up in 2018, 2019. There was a lot of sort of positive hope that there would be you know, federal legalization. That hasn't happened. There's been a lot of momentum at the state level. Most recently, Ohio voted for adult use of cannabis. But that has just not crossed over to these company stocks. They just had another terrible year. And basically what it all sort of hinges on is federal legalization, which seems both like closer and farther than ever. What bulls are looking for next year is the potential that cannabis could be rescheduled, which would move it from sort of a class of drug that is the same as like ketamine or LSD, basically illicit substances. That mean it's, these companies are taxed very highly and they have trouble with their cash flow. So if the DEA moves it to a lower schedule, that would potentially, alleviate some of these pressures on these companies and sort of maybe get the ball rolling on more momentum in the space.
All right, Carmen, great stuff. Thank you very much. Carmen Reineke, she covers all the equities for Bloomberg News, joining us here in our New York studio. Looking at WTI crude oil, it's up 2.5%. We got some heightened concerns transiting oil through the Red Sea. So that part of the world continues to be very volatile. Fernando Valle joins us. He's a senior analyst for Bloomberg Intelligence. He covers the global energy space here. So, Fernando, what's your sense of the risk over there in the Red Sea as to global supply of oil?
I think it's still small. It's obviously a very important region, but it's also because of its significance to both global trade and to the oil trade as well. We think there will be some movements from large geopolitical actors, including the U.S., to secure that shipping lane. So I think the risks of an actual shutdown are very small without much larger conflict, which in itself is a problem. But it is a vital artery of the oil trade.
Do we have a sense of the timetable on this right now?
Well, there have been a few attacks, and I believe the U.S. is already moving one of its air carriers to secure the Red Sea passage. So I think it's an ongoing process right now, which should hopefully help secure movements. I think at the end of the day, the Saudi-Iran deal has kind of held up fairly well. They're trying to make sure that both sides can get their crude out. It doesn't seem like that's devolved, even with the situation in both Yemen and Israel and Gaza.
So I'm seeing, I'm just refreshing my sense of world geography here. The Red Sea's on the west coast of Saudi Arabia, and of course the Persian Gulf is on the eastern side of Saudi Arabia. Where are most of Saudi Arabia's kind of distribution points? Where do they load the ships with their oil to get it out to the world?
It would be primarily on the eastern side, on the Persian side. But there's still a fair amount of trade that goes over on the Red Sea side of the equation, which then in itself would create restrictions on other sources of crude from the region.
What do you think are the most immediate steps that need to be taken in the near term to resolve this?
I think the U.S. moving its air carrier there to help secure, and then potentially some discussions with Houthis, the rebels in Yemen, and to try to solve the equation there will probably be the most immediate actions. Long term, it's a very difficult situation to resolve, and beyond my pay grade to figure out that conflict, but I think that they will. I think in the near term, it's really around the U.S. helping secure those shipping lanes, and it's primarily on the trade side, but it does affect oil volumes as well.
All right, so let's step back about global oil here. Talk to us about what you're seeing, what you're hearing about kind of global demand, because before we had this, increase in risk in the Red Sea, oil had been falling pretty steadily there. So what's your overall call there?
Well, there was another factor that helped oil rally, which is Jay Powell's more dovish stance last week, and that's really been a significant change in pace and helped the oil curve move higher, not just in the front end, but also in the months in 2024. If there are indeed cuts, more than just a pause, that could help demand, and that would be contrary to our views that we still think that rates are likely to stay higher for longer, and that is one of the reasons that we've seen demand being affected as strongly as it has. The question then becomes, are the cuts because demand has fallen very strongly and then we still have some ways to go on the oil side to reflect that, or because we really achieved the soft landing that the Fed hopes for?
Something else you've been watching closely is WTI's discount specifically to Brent and what that could potentially mean if it continues to widen. What sort of levels are you watching? And walk us through what that really means and why investors need to be aware of this.
Yeah, absolutely. Once it goes above 5, that's really when you start seeing some reasons for concern. And the main reason there is the U.S. continues to grow production, shale production, and go into export markets. So if it starts becoming too wide, then the margins that the producers are making in U.S. shale start to get affected, especially because they rely so much on the oil price itself. They don't get a lot of uplift from natural gas prices and NGL prices in the Permian. So if that discount tends to widen out significantly, it means that our tanks are getting filled much faster than outside the U.S., and there's not enough demand for our crude. So that would be a really significant problem for shale producers and for them to continue growing at the pace that they have been.
So what is the 24 outlook in terms of shale production? What are the companies saying?
Well, it's a tale of two sides. You have the majors who are saying it's business as usual and we're going to continue growing. And then you have the independents who are tempering a little bit more, especially the private sides, because rates are higher, oil prices are not where they are, and the discount to Brent is widening. So overall, we think that the rate of growth in U.S. shale is likely to slow in 2024. The consolidation also does that because whereas before, an ExxonMobil Pioneer has spent more combined in the Permian as one entity, they will likely rationalize some of their spending. Same is true for Chevron and Hess in the Bakken, or for Occidental and their newly proposed deal with Crown Quest.
We only have about a minute left, but Russia also eyeing additional oil export cuts. How does that affect OPEC members?
Well, they'll be happy to hear. It's a matter of whether they follow through with it. Part of the cuts were not just, it was half oil and half fuel oil. That the fuel oil part has less of an impact on the overall crude oil side. If they follow through, it's a small percentage. It's 200,000 barrels of actual crude that would be cut, but it would be a positive step towards showing that they are complying with OPEC plus production quotas. There's a question whether they have to cut because they are struggling filling their refineries, but that's a different issue. But that OPEC is not as concerned with.
Fernando, thanks so much for joining us. As always, our go-to guy on global energy, Fernando Valle. He's a senior analyst at Bloomberg Intelligence, been covering the global oil space for decades, knows the geopolitics and knows who all the players are. So when we see moves in oil, that gets our attention here. And again,
that's right.
WTI crude oil up about 2.5% here, $73.21. It had been moving lower here, beginning a little bit of a floor here in the low 70s. Brent, $78.44. We'll have more coming up. This is Bloomberg. Let's get some company news right now with Lisa Mateo.
Thanks, Paul. Jeff Bezos' Blue Origin has hit the reset button on plans to return to space. The company was set to fly more than 30 research and scientific experiments to space on an uncrewed New Shepard vehicle this morning, but it ran into an issue with a ground system at the launch site. The company said it's going to try again this week. Japan's Nippon Steel has agreed to buy United States Steel for $14.1 billion in cash. Bloomberg's Simone Foxman says U.S. Steel has been the talk of the U.S. metals market since August.
It received some bids from the likes of Cleveland Cliffs, from Esmark. Those bids were around $7.25 to $7.8 billion. None of them panned out, but the company did go forward with a strategic review, and apparently that was a smart move.
Now, shares right now, they're up about 27%. But shares of Structure Therapeutics, well, they're taking a pretty bad beating. They're down about 33%. And this is after trial results show that its experimental weight loss pill wasn't as effective as a similar product being developed by Eli Lilly. The company says its GLP-1 drug was well tolerated over the 12 weeks of the study. And after 8 weeks, patients lost more than 4.5% of their body weight. Now, meanwhile, researchers say brain signals in patients taking weight loss drugs such as Novo Nordisk Ozempic and Wegovy and Eli Lilly's Zepbound may contribute to lowering heart disease and deaths. A study says GLP-1 drugs activate anti-inflammatory pathways in the brain and may help treat various diseases. Novo Nordisk are now up about 1.5%. Eli Lilly up 1%. Those are the stories we're following. I'm Lisa Matei.
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 12:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Stocks keep on going. Start of a brand new trading week, and we are looking at lots of green for the Dow, the S&P, and NASDAQ. Even the Russell 2000 advancing now. Little change, but up 0.1%. Dow up 57. That is a gain of 0.2%. S&P up 26 now, up by about 0.6%. The NASDAQ 100 index up 101, up by about 0.6%. And the NASDAQ Composite Index up 84 now, higher by about 0.6%. So green on the screen. Stocks kicking off the week on a positive note, boosted by a burst of deals, even as Fed officials sought to sow doubts that aggressive rate cuts will materialize early next year. 10-year yield 3.95% on the 10-year. The 2-year yield now at 4.46%. Spot gold up $2.50 the ounce to $2,021, up 0.1%. Oil, major story today, surging 2.5%. West Texas Intermediate crude 73.25 a barrel on WTI, while Brent crude 78.52, up by about 2.6%. The U.S. DOT has fined Southwest Airlines $140 million for violating consumer protection laws nearly a year after a late December meltdown of its operations during a storm stranded more than 2 million of its passengers. Again, airline stocks are trading lower. In Pacific, Southwest down by 1.2%. Recapping, stocks higher, S&P up 26, up now by 0.6%. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. We appreciate it. Jess Menton and Paul Sweeney, we're live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker studio. We're streaming live on YouTube as well. So head over to youtube.com and search Bloomberg Radio. All right, I'm looking at mortgage rates. Jess, Freddie Mac enhanced 30-year fixed mortgage rate 6.95%. That's the good news, because it was about 7.65%, actually 7.79% back in late October. So mortgage rates have come down pretty dramatically. The question is that enough to kind of kind of thaw out this market? Let's check in with Selma Hepp, chief economist for CoreLogic. So Selma, I mean, the bad news is rates are still high at 6.95% relative to the last 10 years, but they're they're down pretty substantially from the peak just a couple months ago. What's that mean for the residential real estate market?
Yeah, I think the prospects for 2024 are looking much better now with lower mortgage rates. And, mortgage rates have already been on the decline before the Federal Reserve press conference, but we've seen a substantial decline since then. I think some 60, 70 basis points decline if you look at some other mortgage rate indicators. So we're down to almost 6.5, which is the lowest that we've been since spring of last year. And if you of this year, and if you recall, a spring home buying season, it was pretty strong. Unfortunately, there was not enough inventory, but in terms of buyer activity, it was pretty strong. As a result of that, we did see quite a bit of home price appreciation in spring of this year.
As you know, Fed Chair Powell has flagged about how there tends to be a lag when you're looking at some of the shelter and housing components of some of the key inflation metrics. What's your outlook on where mortgage rates could potentially end the year next year?
So in terms of the shelter inflation component, let me first address that because that's a really interesting question that's really bugging economists out there. So I think the issue is that, the shelter inflation component takes a really long time to play itself out, basically moving pick through the python. And so we are somewhere in the middle of that process. And shelter inflation itself won't return back to its normal rate or the rate that we saw pre-pandemic until a latter part of this year. And so the concern is it really going to take long, or is it going to take shorter amount of time, or when is it really going to return? But nevertheless, in terms of inflation, in terms of mortgage rates, I mean, at this point, we are really thinking about mortgage rates dropping below 6% potentially by the end of next year. I mean, when you look at what the projections are for 10-year treasuries and then mortgage rate spread, we could be below 6% by the end of next year. And that's not where we were, just a few weeks ago. We were thinking 6.3, 6.5. So, I think we could see quite a bit of a boost for the housing market next year.
So then when should people refinance their mortgage?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah. So, just to put it in numbers, over the last year or so, we've seen originations over 6% mortgage rates at about 1.6 million loans. So that refi potential pot is, it's growing. And so I think just depending where you landed between 6 and, over 7%, that's probably going to determine where people are going to refi.
You have some great stats in your notes here about home prices. Home prices have now increased annually for 141 consecutive months and are up by 42% from the onset of the pandemic. That's just extraordinary. Miami, of course, continues to lead the way, but a couple of markets jumped out at me that are actually lagging. Austin, Texas, and Boise, Idaho, still about 10% below last year's peak, because those were probably, for me, kind of the two pandemic destination cities.
Right,
when you're leaving San Francisco or Los Angeles, you
go
go
to
to Austin or
Austin.
Boise. So those markets, I guess, have peaked?
I think so. I mean, I think what happened in those two is that they saw a lot of in-migration from folks that had much higher incomes, and that really drove that home price to income ratio well beyond what people in local market can afford. And so now we're seeing some price adjustment in those markets. The other thing is in Austin too, it is one of the top markets with a lot of new home construction. So it doesn't necessarily stand out as a market that lacks inventory to where we could see more price pressures as a result.
To your point on housing inventory, because Paul and I have talked to guests so much over the past year about that. And in particular, we know not just being exacerbated by the pandemic, but the issues coming out of the great financial crisis. When you're looking more on a regional perspective, what stands out to you as having the biggest issues when it comes to housing inventory, and what areas are better off right now?
Right. I mean, California has been standing out for a long time, not even prior, even prior to the pandemic, but much more so now as a result of the pandemic, because home prices are so much higher and high mortgage rates make a huge effect on affordability. So when we look at where inventory is now relative to where it was pre-pandemic, the largest in Southeast and South, and the contribution there is from new construction, right? So basically markets that do see more new construction tend to fare better in terms of overall inventories. Also because they're more affordable, there is a little bit more turnover. There's some reasons for California to stand out with lack of inventory, and one is Prop 13, which basically sort of locks in your property taxes at that base at which you bought, and then there's a cap on how much those property taxes increase, and so that really keeps people in their homes on the West Coast. So that's a huge difference basically between California markets and some other markets on the east side of the country.
So we continue to hear, when people talk about the real estate business, there's just no supply out there of residential properties. Yeah. What changes that, do you think?
What changes? Well, we definitely need more new construction, and there are some states, that I mentioned have lacked construction for so long, that are trying to implement a higher density lot zoning, so instead of having just one home and an ADU, you can now build up to 4 homes in a single family lot. So they're really trying to densify their single family lotting or single family zoning that they have had for so long. But basically really the solution to our long-term construction problem is building more homes.
And when speaking about inventory, housing build, also job creation that does come with that, are we underestimating what this could potentially mean for job growth in the coming years as inventory still remains an issue here?
Well, absolutely. So you already see that in many markets that have had relatively more new jobs being created tend to be areas where there is more affordable housing. So folks are looking for those affordable opportunities if they're trying to decide on a job move. So I think, for markets that don't have affordable housing options, it's going to be a huge challenge going forward to create more diverse economies. Maybe they will create economies that are very high wage, techy, and so on. But in essence, you really need a more broad-based economy to be a successful metropolitan area.
All right, Selma, thanks so much for joining us. Always appreciate getting your perspective. Selma Hepp, Chief Economist for CoreLogic. Hopefully those rates will continue to come down, and maybe that'll prompt some people to say, all right, I can make the move. That mortgage rate differential from 3% to 7 or 8% is not so bad now.
Right, and we have a ton of housing data on the economic calendar, even though we feel like it's going to be a quiet couple weeks heading into year end, though. But we do have housing starts, building permits tomorrow. Then on Wednesday, existing home sales as well. And then, of course, we'll have new home sales later this week, too. So keep an eye on some of that housing data as it rolls in, Paul.
All right, the existing home sales, I guess the consensus is 3.78 million. That would be flat with last month. So we'll have to see how that plays out, because last month it was down 4% month to month. So again, another weak quarter. Right now, let's head down to Washington, D.C. We're going to get world and national news today with Scott Carr.
Thank you, Paul. Hundreds of thousands of customers are still without power in the Northeast after a major storm with strong winds and heavy rains moved into the region last night. Bloomberg meteorologist Rob Carolyn says rain is still possible across eastern New York and western Massachusetts, up to 5 total inches possible, though he says high winds will likely be the real problem.
Wind advisory in effect for southern New England through 7 p.m. this evening. We'll see some gusts in the New York City area over 30 miles an hour this afternoon. Boston, though, could see some gusts over 45 miles an hour. Washington, D.C., some breaks of sunshine through the afternoon. It will be breezy in the district in Baltimore. Some gusts over 30 miles an hour are possible.
New York City's seen some of the worst of it, with heavy rain and wind gusts up to 45 miles an hour. Another poll out today is showing President Biden is still deep underwater with voters. Bloomberg's Nathan Hager has the details.
The president's approval rating is at an all-time low, 34% in the latest Monmouth University survey. That's down from 54% when Biden first took office. More than 2 in 3 respondents disapprove the president's handling of inflation and the border. The Biden campaign's pointed to improved economic indicators to try to turn those poll numbers around on the economy, but only 12% of respondents say their financial situation is improving. At the same time, 58% say they're optimistic their finances will turn around. In Washington, I'm Nathan Hager, Bloomberg Radio.
The driver of the car that collided with the president's security detail last night has been charged now with driving under the influence of alcohol and inattentive driving. Biden was not harmed. That happened outside Biden's campaign headquarters last evening in Wilmington, Delaware. The late Justice Sandra Day O'Connor is being honored at the Supreme Court today. Her body will lie in repose inside the building's Great Hall so the public can pay their respects. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Scott Carr, and this is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 12:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long at Bloomberg. We have got the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all advancing. We're off session highs, but stocks have kicked off the week on a positive note, boosted by a burst of deals, even as Fed officials seek to sow doubts that aggressive rate cuts will materialize early next year. Here's where we stand, again off session highs with the S&P up 24 at 4734. That is a gain right now of about 0.5%. The Dow up 38, up 0.1%. NASDAQ 100 index keeps on going, up another 98 points, up 0.6%. The NASDAQ Composite Index up 81, up by about 0.5%. Russell 2000 higher, little changed, up now by 0.1%. 10-year yield 3.95% with a 2-year 4.45%. Gold up $3 the ounce to 2022, up by about 0.2%. And West Texas Intermediate crude oil up 2.5%, 73.23 for a barrel of WTI. Apple will stop selling the Watch Series 9 and Ultra 2 in the U.S. just before Christmas as a result of a patent dispute over the blood oxygen center. Dan Ives is with Wedbush Securities, and this morning, right here on Bloomberg Markets, he told us he is not too concerned.
I mean, look, there have been some issues on the Apple Watch side, and a lot of it is really around models in terms of what they're trying to drive. I view this as just a small bump in the road, but I actually think watch sales this holiday season are going to be up double digits. So I view this as sort of noise relative to the broader story.
And you can hear more of that conversation on the Tape podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcasts. Ives, by the way, has an outperform rating on the stock along with a $250 price target. To put that in context, Apple right now, $195.35. Apple shares down now by 1.1%. Recapping stocks higher. S&P up 24, a gain there of 0.5%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Charlie Pelleton, thank you so much. We appreciate it. Jess Metton and Paul Sweeney live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio, streaming live as well on YouTube. So head over there and check us out. You know, I've been long saying that it just seems to me for the next generation, one of the really big growth stories is going to be cybersecurity.
Yes,
I mean,
it is.
You can't go wrong there. Everybody's got to spend money to,
That's right.
protect their networks. I'm looking at Palo Alto Networks here. Stock, it's a $97 billion market cap stock. I guess the market agrees with my assessment. Stock's up 120% year to date. So Wendy Whitmore joins us. She's a senior vice president and head of the cybersecurity team at Palo Alto Networks. But her highlight of her resume is she's on Duke University Master of Engineering in Cybersecurity Industry Advisory Board. That's a mouthful, but anybody who's associated with Duke can stay. Wendy, can you tell us what Unit 42 is?
Absolutely. So great to be here. Unit 42 is really the eyes and ears on the ground for all of Palo Alto Network. So we are the special forces unit, if you will, that really responds on the ground to all of our clients' situations. So oftentimes that's helping them in their worst day, everything from responding to breaches to doing the research and analysis on the front end to understand what cyber attackers are doing, and then threat hunting on nodes throughout the world to identify the latest and greatest attack patterns.
Well, there were a number of big cyber attacks this year alone. Why do you think this is, and will they continue to escalate?
Unfortunately, they absolutely will continue. I think you mentioned it, cyber is really the story in terms of a major industry moving forward. The reality is right now there's a lot of money to be made by attackers in the space. So what's happened is we have major geopolitical activity going on throughout the world, right? Every region from EMEA to certainly in the Asia Pacific rim as well. And so when you have that occurring, you oftentimes behind the scenes have nation state actors continuing to propagate activity even more. And so we're seeing that. What we're also seeing, though, is a combination of cyber criminals becoming more sophisticated. Again, this relates to money being made and the reality that there's a lot of money to be made in the space. But cyber criminals in particular really understand how businesses operate, their level of interconnectivity between B2B type of markets, and they're taking advantage of that as we speak.
So, you know, in 2023, one of the investing drivers here was AI, artificial intelligence, and first time I kind of heard that, I was like, oh boy, you put AI together with criminals, how bad can this get? So how do you guys at Palo Alto Networks, when you talk to your clients, how do you frame out AI as an opportunity, but as also a risk?
Absolutely. So I think with any new advancement in technology, there are pros and there are cons. On the pro side, we have leveraged AI, in particular precision AI, as well as machine learning, to advance our technologies and detect these attacks. And that's been going on for years. But what we've seen over the past year in particular is the advancement of generative AI. And that is obviously enabling a lot more effective human communications. And that's everything from written to verbal, and in some cases, video. So we think from a defender perspective, there is a whole lot of great things that we can leverage from Gen AI, and we're doing that today to advance our analysis, to make sure that we're leveraging our human resources for the most difficult problems and automating as much as possible on the front end for our machines to solve. That said, the attackers are also doing something similarly. What we're seeing today is their use of heavy reliance on the communications piece. So whether that's in crafting spear phishing emails or communications on the written side, or in some cases, whether that's impersonating verbal communications to circumvent employee identity verification so that they can break into an environment. We're seeing the full spectrum.
Talk to us about this new SEC ruling and how it relates to cybersecurity.
Well, so we're seeing increased regulation across the board, right? So what we're looking at from the SEC is an emphasis for reporting from individual organizations. I think the challenges are in terms of timeframes. Oftentimes, you know the least, and not oftentimes, always. You know the least at the beginning of an investigation, and so those first 48 to 72 hours to weeks are really where we're identifying a lot of information, and it can be very dynamic, right? It is changing constantly. One thing that I think we're seeing that's really interesting coming from the SEC notification is the fact that attackers have now, and again, we're talking about cyber criminals, not nation state actors, at least not yet, but cyber criminals saying, well, hey, I'm going to use this to my advantage. And if I compromise an organization and they didn't report it yet, I'm going to let the SEC know, and I'm going to file a disclosure notification myself, which is causing, obviously even more headache around the notification challenges.
Wendy, do we know what percentage of cyber crime is by individuals, a couple knuckleheads in the garage versus, nation states?
That's a great question. I'm not sure anyone can answer that completely comprehensively, but I would say a significant amount of the activity, certainly that we see and that our competitors see, is focused on nation state. The difference there is that it often, really runs under the scenes, right? It's not something where these attackers are stealing information and data and then sharing it publicly, right? They are providing it to some sort of analytical capability on the back end so that they can identify information usually targeted against a political objective. That's very different than when you have a cyber criminal who's looking to cause disruption to business, right? We're seeing that today with disruption to retailers, on their busiest period, trying to satisfy orders before the holiday season. And, we see that over the past few months, you saw disruption in Las Vegas in terms of operational impact. People can't check into hotel rooms. They can't place bets, right? So we see really two different objectives there.
All right, Wendy, thank you so much for joining us. Fascinating stuff. And again, if you think back to the movie The Graduate, plastics as being the future, cybersecurity, right, I think is the future here. Wendy Whitmore, Senior Vice President and head of the cybersecurity team at Palo Alto Network. Do you think she gets some panic phone calls in the middle of the night? Do you think that happens from clients? It's like,
I would imagine.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, what a business! But again, Palo Alto Networks, that stock has just had a rip up over 100% this year, and that kind of reflects, I guess, in large part, kind of what we're seeing out there, that there's incredible demand for cybersecurity out there. Taking a quick snapshot of these markets, the S&P 500 is up 0.5%, the Nasdaq's up about the same, yields a little bit higher here. Actually, the 10-year Treasury yields up about 4 basis points.
Also, S&P only about 1% away from a record.
That is a beautiful thing as we approach year end. How about that? This is Bloomberg.
Now, your company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
Good morning, I'm Lisa Mateo. Apple shares lower this morning after news that it will stop selling the latest versions of its smartwatch in the U.S. That's due to a patent dispute over the device's blood oxygen sensor technology. Sales of the Apple Watch Series 9 and Ultra 2 will be halted on the company's online store on Thursday and at its retail locations beginning on Christmas Eve. Now, back in October, the International Trade Commission, it ruled that Apple violates patents from Massimo and would need to halt sales of infringing devices. A presidential review of that order is now underway. But that's not all Apple has to be worried about. More government agencies and state firms in China have ordered staff not to bring iPhones to work. Bloomberg's Alex Webb says it's extended it to 8 further regions.
These sales in and of themselves are unlikely to take a significant dent out of the $17 billion in revenue that Apple does in China. But China is, of course, one of the few bright spots in growth that Apple has right now. And if there is a push to support more Chinese manufacturers, a sort of nationalist push that we saw 6 or 7 years ago, well, 6 or 7 years ago, that created a $20 billion decline in revenue over a number of years.
Apple shares are down more than 1%. And Adobe has walked away from its $20 billion acquisition of startup Figma after clashing with regulators in Europe and the UK. Adobe will pay Figma $1 billion termination fee. That deal would have been one of the largest takeovers ever of a private software maker. Adobe right now up about 2%. Those are the company stories we're following this hour. We'll have more Bloomberg Markets in just a bit. I'm Lisa Mateo. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, looking at these markets, we have the S&P up 0.5%. Same thing for the NASDAQ. Yields a little bit higher here, 5%, 5 basis points higher on your 30-year. That's at 4.06%. So back above 4% on the 10-year, up 4 basis points, 3.95%. WTI crude oil, it's up 2.6%, $73.30. So we'll keep an eye on that. Right now, let's head down to Washington, D.C. We'll get world and national news with
Scott Carr.
Scott Carr, perfect.
Thanks, Paul. Shares in Apple have fell by as much as 1.6% today after the company said it would soon stop selling its Apple Watch Series 9 and Ultra 2 models. This is after an International Trade Commission ruling that was part of a long-running patent dispute around Apple Watch's blood oxygen sensor technology. 9 to 5 Max reporting the models will no longer be available to order from Apple's website in the U.S. after this Thursday afternoon. Wedbush Securities Managing Director Dan Ives says ultimately the law shouldn't hit Apple too hard.
There have been some issues on the Apple Watch side, and a lot of it is really around models in terms of what they're trying to drive. I view this as just a small bump in the road, but I actually think watch sales this holiday season are going to be up double digits. So I view this as sort of noise relative to the broader story.
The Series 9 watch and the Ultra 2 model will be available for purchase from other outlets, though, including Amazon and Best Buy. The parent company of footwear maker Timberland, Vans, and the North Face VF Corp is working to get back up and running after a cyber attack shut down their systems and resulted in the theft of some company data. Shares fell by as much as 7% this morning. Oil firm BP now suspending all shipping through the Red Sea because of security concerns. This after a series of targeted attacks by Yemen's Iran-backed Houthi rebels in recent weeks. BP becomes the first oil company to directly halt its own shipping after 5 big shipping companies stopped their vessels from passing through their waters. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Scott Carr, and this is Bloomberg. Back to you, Paul.
All right, Scott Carr, thank you so much. We appreciate that. God bless you.
Thank you. I tried not to do that while it's like, oh no, turn my mic off.
All right, here we go on the student loan repayment front. Nearly 9 million student loan borrowers did not pay after bills restarted. Following a 3-year pause, payments on federal student debt officially began again in October, 3 months after President Biden's one-time forgiveness plan fell through. Yet, 40% of the 22 million borrowers who had bills due did not make their payments by mid-November. That's according to U.S. Department of Education. And student loan borrowers provide a window into the financial health of everyday Americans who are grappling with higher housing costs, automobile debt, and increased food bills that have strained household budgets.
You know, something I'm curious about when I see numbers like this, because I had a number of friends who were either furloughed, lost their job during COVID, but these are obviously these numbers about federal student loans, but some of them also had private loans as well. But whenever they started their repayments, some of their lenders had sold their loans to a new lender and a new servicer too, and they kind of had to get things started up. So, for instance, I don't want to say any names of certain servicers out there, but when they tried to get auto pay set up, it did, for whatever reason, their system wasn't working.
Right.
And so it didn't count as that. So it would tell them they missed their payment, but eventually they were able trying to rectify it. So it kind of makes me wonder sometimes when I look at the numbers, how many people were in those kind of situations too, and whether or not maybe it's a little bit less than that. But we'll see how this all shakes out in the coming months. But some other problems, some anecdotally.
Yep. Exactly. So there are signs that even fewer borrowers made payments in November. Each month, the Department of Education transfers the money received from student loan payments to the U.S. Treasury. That amount dropped to $5.3 billion last month, down 25% from the almost $7 billion transferred in both September and October. Many borrowers threw money at their balances during those months to get ahead of the interest restart. So again, that's a big issue for a lot of Americans, a lot of young folks out there that are trying to buy a house,
correct?
You know, do lots of other things that you do at that time of your life, and they've got the student loan things here, and that was it is a much bigger thing than my generation.
Yes.
So
I'm a millennial, so I definitely am in that.
Yeah. So it's something we didn't necessarily have to deal with to the same extent that the kids do today. All right, we're gonna have we're gonna talk about that. Sound On, is that coming up next?
That's right.
Joe
with
Matthew.
Joe Matthew.
That's coming up right now.
from our nation's capital, this is Bloomberg Sound On.
Two major stories that we're following here developing before our eyes.
What does it say about Trump's influence on the Republican Party?
What can the Biden administration do on its own to support Israel?
Bloomberg Sound On. Politics, policy, and perspective from D.C.'s top names.
The Republican caucus is at war with itself.
Members of Congress would have a press conference every day if somebody would cover that.
There is bipartisan support for Israel.
This is one of the big ones we only see once every decade or 2 decades in the Middle East.
Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
The Pentagon warns it will run out of money for Ukraine in less than 2 weeks. Welcome to the fastest show in politics. As the Defense Department spends its last billion, it appears, to buy new weapons and equipment to replace those drawn down from our stockpiles. And it'll all be gone by December 30th, it appears. Bloomberg News has obtained a letter from the DoD with details on this. We'll talk about it and discuss a lot more with Melinda Herring, the senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center, just back from Kyiv, and a fascinating conversation for us straight ahead. Chances for a border deal appear to be dimming as we head for year-end. And the White House calls out Donald Trump for his rhetoric over the weekend. We'll talk about all of it with our signature panel. Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis and Gidi Shanzano are with us for the hour. And we start, as always, with a look at Wall Street. Let's get up to date on trading now with Markets. Charlie Pellet in New York. Hey, Charlie.
Hi, thank you very much. Indeed, 7 weeks of gains for the S&P 500 index, and those gains continue on this Monday. S&P 500 index up 25. That is a gain now of about 0.5%. We have got the Dow up 240. Up by about 0.1%. The Nasdaq Composite Index up 88, higher by about 0.6%. 10-year yield 3.95%. The 2-year 4.45%. Gold up 0.6%. 2,031 the ounce. West Texas Intermediate crude is surging 2.6%. 73.30 for a barrel of WTI. Brent, the global benchmark, 78.60, up now by 2.7%. Bottom line here: stocks have kicked off the week on a positive note, boosted by a burst of deals, even as Fed officials seek to sow doubts that aggressive rate cuts will materialize early next year. As for the inflation backdrop heading into the new year, Kathy Bostancic is chief economist at Nationwide Mutual Insurance.
Activity is slowing. Now, we may not get the mild recession we're forecasting. Even if you get a soft landing, you're going to have slower growth. That takes pressure off of inflation, especially in the goods market. When we look at China, right? China's struggling and their domestic demand's weak. It looks like they're pushing out their goods onto the global market. That only kind of reinforces deflation in the goods sector.
And you can hear more of that conversation on the Surveillance podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcast. The Department of Transportation has fined Southwest Airlines $140 million for violating consumer protection laws nearly a year after that late December meltdown of its operations during a storm stranded more than 2 million passengers. DOT says the penalty is 30 times larger than any other consumer protection violation fine it has issued. Southwest shares down today by 0.7%. Recapping stocks higher, S&P up 23, up 0.5%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Okay, Charlie, thank you. Welcome to the Monday edition of Bloomberg Sound On. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington, where there are not many left. The House is gone. As we told you at the end of last week, there are some senators still in town waiting maybe for something to happen on a deal with the border. But the language we heard, despite a flurry of negotiating over the weekend, does not sound great. Not that this has been derailed, but the idea of it happening by the end of the year might be a bit of a stretch. And that's not good news for Ukraine, which, of course, would be forced to wait for funding that's been requested now for some time. And as I read on the terminal, a new warning from the Pentagon, a letter just obtained from Bloomberg News. Before we talk to Melinda Herring, it's very important. The Pentagon says it will run out of money, and we knew this from Shalanda Young at the administration, that the end of the year would not be good for financing Ukraine. But now we have details. We have a level of detail we did not have before. Pentagon will run out of money to replace weapons sent to Ukraine by December 30, unless, of course, some miracle happened on Capitol Hill. Spending now the last $1 billion to buy new weapons and equipment that will replace those drawn down from stockpiles and sent to Ukraine. This is from the Pentagon controller, a December 15 letter that we have obtained says that on December 30, 15 days after this letter was sent, its accounts will be empty. Now, that was the message over the weekend from Chris Van Hollen, the Democratic senator from Maryland, on ABC this week, without necessarily those details, but certainly the same spirit. Here he is.
We need to make sure that we help our Ukrainian friends against Putin's aggression, not just to protect their freedom, but because it would send a terrible signal around the world to our allies who would no longer trust us, and to our adversaries who would be emboldened if we're not doing that.
That's where we begin our conversation with Melinda Herring, and I have a lot more questions for Melinda than just beyond this, but quite a starting point for us here. Of course, a voice of assurance and authority on this topic, and has been with us talking about this since the very beginning, the very early stages of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center, and back with us now live on Bloomberg Sound On. Melinda, it's great to see you. You have a date to circle now on the calendar. What does that mean in your calculation as you watch the lack of action here in Washington?
Hey, Joe, thanks for having me back. So I'm fresh in from Kiev, and I think I still have those sort of Ukraine goggles on, and it's really scary. There is a lot of gratitude in Ukraine for everything that Washington has done, but there's also frustration. I think that folks in Ukraine don't understand how desperate the situation is. So there's not enough ammo, and that's been well documented. There's not enough men. It's cold, it's winter, and what Washington does, others will do. So I think all eyes are on Congress, but it looks like this is going to get pushed back to January. And we know the longer this goes on, the more likely it's going to be difficult to pass. And frankly, it's not really a Ukraine issue anymore. The Congress is not going to move until this national security bill, this border issue, is resolved. So it's incumbent on the White House to make this happen if they really want to make sure that Ukraine can win the war.
Well, if this is a month, if you're right, and a lot of folks seem to think that could happen, Melinda, there's a deal on the border. Maybe over the holidays, lawmakers come back, they pass the bill and get it done. Money goes to Ukraine, maybe late January, February, I think is kind of the timeline you're working on there. Did we just send them enough in this latest $1 billion, or apparently last for now, $1 billion tranche to get them through that period of time?
I don't know exactly. I don't have the numbers in front of me, Joe, but what I do know is that there's not enough ammunition. And the Ukrainians announced today they don't have enough Soviet ammunition. And this is something they've been pleading and begging for. The Europeans promised to put supply chains in place to build the ammunition they needed. The United States also promised to put those things in place, and it hasn't happened. So we're months and years behind the reality on the ground, and it's going to cause commanders and generals in Ukraine to have to make decisions that they don't want to make. It's going to limit their military options. So the decisions that we're making here in Washington have real life consequences for Ukrainian soldiers. But I think let's broaden this a bit. This is not just about Ukraine. You and I have talked about this, a dozen times. What happens in Ukraine doesn't stay in Ukraine. That's why it's so crucial to get these funds to Ukraine, and the broader picture too. Also in Europe, we saw last week, Orban is vetoing an enormous $54 billion from the EU. And that's the money that keeps the state afloat. So Ukraine, the situation in Ukraine is precarious on a number of different levels.
There's so much to ask you about here, Melinda. Before I get to that EU funding, talk to me more about this supply chain, because this has been in the air essentially since the first batch of weapons we sent, because we knew it would be difficult to replace them. We don't have the supply chain or the manufacturing chain here in the U.S. to take care of ourselves, never mind Ukraine. And you've just pointed to an important promise from our European allies as well. What should be up and running right now? What do we need to build?
So the Europeans and the Americans need to basically move to a war footing in terms of getting the Ukrainians the kind of shells they need. The Ukrainians have been very explicit, Joe, on these are the sort of precision weapons that we need. These are the right ammo we need. And it's a complicated process, and we haven't put it in place. So, if we want Ukraine to win the war, President Biden has the authority to make this happen. European governments can stand this up. It's really a question of political will.
The ask from the White House is roughly $60 billion most of which actually would be invested here in the U.S. in our own defense contractors. But you pointed out the EU. That's $55 billion, Melinda, and the EU now will hold a special summit, I read, on the 1st of February to discuss this 4-year funding package, which is being held up by opposition from Viktor Orban, of all people. How important is that money when we try to frame the urgency around the request here in the U.S.? Where would this money go, and how badly does Ukraine need it now?
So desperately is the right word. There's 3 categories of aid. There's the military assistance, and the U.S. is the leader on that. We've done an awesome job. We haven't done enough. We've been way too slow, especially on the ammo side, and we haven't sent enough weapons. When I was in Kiev last week, I met with a parliamentarian, and he said, "Thank you for the ATACMS, but 35, give me a break. Like we need hundreds. We need as many as possible." So there's the military side. There's the economic side, and the EU has been the leader on this. And this is the money that keeps the state alive. It keeps the railways going. It keeps homes lit. It keeps pensions paid. This is really important, and the EU has been the leader on this. So if the EU can't get this through, it's going to make it much, much harder for Ukraine as a state to exist. And then the third bucket is the humanitarian assistance.
Manpower is something that you mentioned, and we talked about this when you were just back last week. It's not just men to fight, young, strong men to fight, but just people to help with this response and to keep society going here, Melinda. Put that in perspective for us.
Sure. So, Joe, in October, I went out to Zaporizhia, which is one of the provinces that Vladimir Putin claims he now belongs to Russia. And I spoke to a number of people, and the feeling there among Ukrainian soldiers is that we Ukrainian soldiers who have been fighting for more than 600 days are sticking our necks out, and all of society in Ukraine is not helping. Some people are having normal lives, and they haven't done enough. And that there needs to be a bigger mobilization, and that President Zelensky needs to put the economy on a war footing, and everyone needs to be contributing so that the war can be ended as soon as possible. I've heard that sentiment again and again, and I would say that that's growing frustration in Ukraine right now.
We're spending time with Melinda Herring from the Atlantic Council amid this debate in Washington on whether to or how to or to what extent the U.S. should be funding Ukraine. President Zelensky was here not that long ago while you were in Kyiv, as a matter of fact, Melinda. He understands the debate here in the United States, the political element here domestically that's impacting funding for his own country. What do people in Kyiv say about this?
What do people in Kyiv say about Zelensky's visit? I think they're glad that
the fact that we're holding this up actually on our own border dispute. That's something that he's aware of. He's a politician. He's in touch with Joe Biden. But what do people walking around Kyiv say about securing the border in El Paso?
They're so confused, Joe. They're like, why are you guys conflating the two? What do these have to do with each other? And the answer is, we don't know. They're not. They're totally unrelated. And then I have to explain wonderful American domestic politics, that this is a way to get something that the GOP wants and give Biden a black eye. But in Ukraine, when there's air sirens, in the front lines, when it's a matter of life and death, this feels really silly. It's really hard to explain how petty the politics are here in a war zone.
General Mark Kimmett here on this program, Melinda, suggested that if there was a lapse in funding, if that had to happen, that landing in the middle of a bitter cold winter might in fact be the best time for it to, as fighting begins to slow down. I wonder if you agree with that, knowing the hell that Ukrainian soldiers are about to go through.
I think the general has a point, Joe. So I don't agree on humanitarian assistance, but on military assistance, if you have to pick a point to slow it down, sure, that makes sense. And we're at a bit of a lull right now. It's still a hot war, but it's there's limited options you have during a winter period. But from a humanitarian perspective, if you can't heat homes, if you don't have water, if the trains can't run, if you can't pay pensions, and it's 20 degrees, you're going to have a big humanitarian crisis. And I think the bigger point is that's what Vladimir Putin wants. You know, we discussed this many times. What was the rocket strategy last year that Putin threw all over Ukraine? And it was to try to create massive migration and scare the hell out of people so that they would leave and go to Europe. And he did not accomplish that. So, you know, in some ways, Putin is getting what he wants sort of piece by piece and incrementally. And if I have to sum up where I think we are, I think this is the strategy. He doesn't have to unleash this horrible, super aggressive rocket strategy. If you look at the number of rockets he's shooting this year compared to last year, the number is quite a bit lower. And I think Putin thinks he has the West and Ukraine exactly where he wants us. He's very tactical and he's very patient, and he thinks that he cares more about Ukraine than the West does.
Wow. Chilling analysis from Melinda Herring. Melinda, thank you for your firsthand accounts and your insights today, as always. I look forward to these conversations. She's Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. Melinda Herring with us live on Bloomberg. Let's assemble the panel so Rick and Jeannie can take a swing at what we have here. Our signature panel is back today, Bloomberg Politics contributors. Rick, there was some skepticism, maybe I can use that word, on Capitol Hill when the White House sent a letter about when Ukraine funding would run out here. Now we've got it from the Pentagon. Does that create any new urgency?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit more urgency. It's not like the Senate negotiators don't already know that. Maybe it puts a little pressure on the House guys as they are at home having explained this to their constituents. But it also, foretells a story about how equipped is the Department of Defense and the Biden administration in being able to support this to begin with. I mean, we just heard from Melinda about, how frustrated the Ukrainians have been about not getting enough weapon systems on time, to be able to fight the war that they're trying to fight. And I think the Biden administration has to really calibrate. Are they really ready to support this, especially if there's not an immediate funding between now and the end of the year?
Does a letter like this matter, Jeannie, when the whole thing rides on a border deal?
Does matter. But, I thought what Melinda said to you, which was so chilling, was not only the description of the cold and the lack of men and the lack of ammunition, but the confusion of Ukrainians. I mean, there's confusion for Americans, but imagine the confusion for Ukrainians, thinking that their future depends on a border deal between the U.S. and Mexico to address a problem that has been vexing us for decades. So you can just really, really feel their pain and frustration on this. And yet, as we look at what's happening in Congress, and I know we're going to talk about that, it doesn't sound like they're going to get any, at least in the short term, any relief or any clarification or clarity on that. And it's got to be just, god-awful for them sitting over there watching this.
Well, Jeannie is right. We're going to flip the coin on this, talk about the border deal or lack thereof next on Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 121 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Stocks are advancing, building on 7 weeks of gains for the S&P 500 index. So stocks have kicked off the week on a positive note, lifted by a burst of deals, even as Fed officials seek to sow doubts that aggressive rate cuts will materialize early next year. S&P up 25, a gain of 0.5%. Dow Industrials up 19. Little change now, up less than 0.1%. The NASDAQ 100 index is up 111 points, up by about 0.7%. The NASDAQ Composite Index is up 94, a gain there of 0.6%. 10-year yield 3.95%. The 2-year 4.45%. Gold up just about $8 the ounce now to $2,027. That is a gain of 0.4%. And West Texas Intermediate crude 73.26 a barrel. WTI right now is advancing by 2.6%. VF Corp says it is working to restore its ability to fulfill orders following a cyber attack. Though the company has not determined the full scope of the incident, VF Corp shares down 6.9%. VF is the parent of North Face, Timberland, and Vans. Recapping stocks higher, S&P up 25, a gain of 0.5%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
This is Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
So as I mentioned, the senators are still kicking around Washington. I mean, I guess it's a pretty good time to be here. They've got the Christmas tree up across the street, the city center there. The Capitol tree is pretty nice, and you could park kind of anywhere right now, maybe get a table at your favorite restaurant. The problem is the border deal they were supposed to be sticking around for does not appear to be emerging. And that may be all right, considering the fact that, for the last 20 or 30 years, we haven't been able to get this done. So another 5 minutes, maybe this bleeds into January. If you ask Lindsey Graham, and of course, all this at the expense of the people of Ukraine, as we were just discussing with Melinda and the panel. Lindsey Graham on Sunday morning TV says, don't hold your breath.
I think this will go into next year. I've been talking to the people at the table. The White House got engaged 5 days ago. They sent over a supplemental with border security provisions that did nothing to change policy. We've been talking to them since September. 5 days ago, they finally sat at this table. Senator Lankford's doing a good job. The bottom line here is we feel like we're being jammed. We're not anywhere close to a deal. It'll go into next year.
A lot of talk about being jammed now. Interesting. As we hear from the players at the table, James Lankford, Chris Murphy, Kirsten Sinema, they say they're making progress. But look, there's a lot of details here. Even on the big strokes, behind all of them, there are great details. Mitch McConnell and Senator Lankford, by the way, sent a note to colleagues. Remember, we talked about the Dear Colleague letter. It's never good. In this case, says Republicans will not be rushed to a deal this week. And if Chuck Schumer moves forward with plans for a procedural vote, as he promised to, quote, it would not succeed, unquote. So let's reassemble the panel for their take. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, of course, with us here, Bloomberg Politics contributors. Rick, I don't know where we're going here. Everyone could look like a genius if a deal emerges, say, the first or second week of January. How much space should we give them?
Yeah, look, I mean, you're going to have to give them whatever space you can because it's the only game in town. And I think the Dear Colleague letter was just a rearguard action to try and keep some of the caucus, like Lindsey Graham, quiet because they've been upset that they don't know the details of this negotiation. So, look, anytime you have a group of people, especially a tri-party negotiation like this with Sinema and Lankford and Murphy, a Democrat, a Republican, and an independent, all trying to negotiate a deal, everybody in those other caucuses, the R's and the D's, are going to feel left out and concerned. And so all of a sudden Biden comes in there and starts saying, hey, we got to really get this done for the people of Israel, for the people of Ukraine, for our southern border. Then they're going to feel jammed. My own view, I think the White House ought to turn its time and attention on the Democrats, get them to say yes to a deal. It's much more important, frankly, for the Democrats to get a deal than it is for Republicans right now. But bottom line is, sure doesn't sound like a deal's imminent. And so We're talking about a completely insane January, considering all the things that Congress are going to have to do within 30 days of coming back on the 8th of January.
I say we just go to Des Moines and we'll hide there, Rick and Jeannie, until this is sorted out. I don't know, Jeannie. I want to hear from you on this. Let's say Joe Biden does start calling Democrats. I don't know what progress he can make without something a little bit more detailed to sell. But you hear Lindsey Graham there, a lot of backhands at the White House. Hey, they just started 5 days ago. Should Joe Biden have gotten on this earlier?
Yeah, I have to agree on that. I think the White House needed to be present earlier on this, but quite frankly, that said, I'm not sure it would have helped. He's got a real problem on his hands. Number one, he decided to put all of this forward in one big lump. And of course, you're talking about some of the most vexing problems. And while it made sense in one perspective, if this thing doesn't turn out, there's going to be a lot of rethinking about this approach. And so I think the White House has got to own that part of it. Of course, the incentives for Republicans to do anything on the border at this point are nil. And we heard from Donald Trump over the weekend. Does anybody think he is going to help make this an easy vote for any Republicans? That's the reality. He doesn't want anything on the border, a deal for Biden. He also doesn't want to support Ukraine. You couple that with what's happening on the left. Progressives don't want Biden to give away the store. So this is a huge, enormous challenge. And, January 8th, Langford is saying they might have something to do. Well, they've got a lot to do. They return. There's the Iowa caucus. Four departments run out of money on the 19th. The 29th, we have New Hampshire. And then right after that, the rest of the government runs out of funding. So the idea that you're going to fix the border in any kind of concerted way in those couple weeks is really, really tough to imagine at this point.
I shouldn't be laughing, but just listening to you two guys describe January, I'm taking the month off. Rick, Jeannie brings up a really interesting point here, and that's Donald Trump, because I don't know which way this cuts. We understand now that he is in regular talks. He's in regular contact with Speaker Mike Johnson. So what happens if Donald Trump tells Republicans to vote against the deal?
Yeah, I think that it just depends upon what the terms of the bill is going to be. First of all, getting Mike Johnson to put it on the calendar will be number one. If there's a Senate deal, it'll go on the House calendar. The question is, will it be a bipartisan vote? Typically, it would be a bipartisan vote. We've seen over 300 members willing to support these kinds of transactions. It doesn't really matter what the Freedom Caucus thinks about this or Donald Trump if you have 200 Democrats voting with you. So, look, I think that the House is going to take care of itself. Donald Trump is lobbying against Ukraine funding. He's lobbying against funding for the border. The last thing he wants to do is these things become Republican orthodoxy, because he's way outside of the normal Republican level of support for these things. Even the public, Republicans support it more than Donald Trump does. So the last thing he wants to do is have to react to this when he's fighting away, as Jeannie said, in Iowa on the 15th and the 23rd in New Hampshire. These are not things he's going to spend time talking about. So I don't know. I mean, it'll be interesting, because if the House does take it up and it keeps it as an open vote, I think it could be an incredible rebuke to Donald Trump at the hands of, his sort of, favorite speaker today.
Well, it would be, which is why I am deeply curious about that. And I think, to your point, Jeannie, he's not going to like anything that comes up here that doesn't involve a wall with his name on it. I didn't know if I should bring this up or not. I've got to ask you both about this little scandal that came up over the weekend. A Senate staffer is out of a job, a staffer to Senator Ben Cardin, after recording a graphic sex tape. This is real. In the historic Hart 216 hearing room. The encounter, we'll say, happened on the dais. The Daily Caller out with tapes over the weekend. I'm just wondering if this is done. I have to ask you guys about it. Our listeners and viewers, I don't think would forgive me if I didn't. This is all I heard about for half the weekend. Jeannie, does there need to be an investigation, or he got fired, so let's move on? Because this won't help the way people look at the Hill.
I wish you had gone to Rick Davis on this first, because he's going to have a lot to say on this. No, I think he fired. He should have been fired. Obviously, I did not see the tapes, assuming they are real, and there does need to be an investigation. Because my gosh, are our government buildings just open for these kinds of things? Well,
that's the question.
It's baffling to me that this could happen. I kept thinking it was a deep fake. I'm not saying it was, but I sort of hope it was, but I have no evidence that it was.
It was.
So,
that's the question, Rick. I'm going to him right now. Look, I mean, there's a lot of salacious stuff you could talk about here, but are we to believe that all these rooms are open for access? This is same room played host to Supreme Court nominees, 9/11 Commission hearings. This is right where Senator Chris Coons was sitting, for crying out loud. Should we be concerned?
I don't think you have to be too concerned about staffers going into hearing rooms, right? If this was, just a couple of people walking through the Capitol on a tour and decide to have sex in a hearing room, that'd be one thing. I'd be more concerned about the cleanliness of that hearing room the next time they take a seat on that dive.
I hope there's a real effort to do that. We'll move on from here, but my goodness, someone need to call the sergeant at arms. You were both very graceful with that, by the way. I just, everyone's kicking out this homemade video. What do the Capitol Police have? Aren't there cameras in all these rooms? I digress. Let's check world and national news. Thank God Scott Carr is standing by in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom here in Washington. Hi, Scott.
Good afternoon, Joe. Israel's under growing pressure to restart negotiations aimed at a humanitarian pause in its war with Hamas. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin's in Tel Aviv today, underscoring the U.S. commitment to Israel and the need to protect civilians from harm in the Gaza Strip, as CIA Director William Burns meets today with Qatari and Israeli officials in Poland in an effort to set the stage for further talks. A storm moving up the East Coast. It's already drenched parts of Florida and South Carolina. It's knocked out power to thousands, grounded hundreds of flights. Bloomberg meteorologist Rob Carolyn says New York City has seen some of the worst of it, with heavy rain and wind gusts up to 45 miles an hour. Though Fort Lauderdale's had to cancel its big Winterfest boat show. The mayor there, Dean Trentella, says that'll mean a loss of about $50 million for his community.
The major damage are people that, paid money to rent boats and decorations and catering, and people had lots of parties planned. This is a significant event for the city. It's unique to Fort Lauderdale.
Flood warnings and watches still stretch from Maine to North Carolina. Pope Francis is clearing the way for same-sex couples to receive blessings under certain conditions. The Vatican announced that landmark decision today, saying the priests can give the blessings if they're not given as part of a regular church ritual. A new record in enforcement activity regarding mergers has now been set by the Biden administration. New data from Bloomberg shows the Federal Trade Commission's brought 24 enforcement actions, while the Justice Department's brought 26. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Scott Carr, and this is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
1:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We begin with the developing story headline right off of the Bloomberg Professional Service. Nikola founder Trevor Milton has been ordered to spend 4 years behind bars for lying to shareholders about the electric truck maker's progress. Milton sentenced today by U.S. District Judge Edgardo Ramos in Manhattan more than a year after a jury convicted him of securities fraud and wire fraud for misrepresenting key details about the development of Nikola's products and technologies. So again, repeating the headline, Nikola founder Trevor Milton ordered to spend 4 years behind bars. Stocks are moving higher. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, though, little changed, up just 2 points right now. Stocks did kick off the week on a positive note, lifted by a burst of deals. S&P up 24, close to session highs, up by about 0.5%. NASDAQ 100 up 115 points, up 0.7%. NASDAQ Composite Index up 99, up by 0.7%. Russell 2000 is lower now by 0.1%. The Russell down now by 2 points. We do have the 10-year yielding 3.95%, with a 2-year now at 4.45%. West Texas Intermediate crude oil up 0.3%. Right now, WTI, as I mentioned, pushing higher, actually up 2.2%, 78.27 for a barrel of Brent crude. WTI up 2.2%, 72.97 a barrel. Gold is up 0.3%, 2,025 the ounce on the precious metal. Home builder confidence scored a gain this month, and with that story, here's Bloomberg's Vinny Del Giudice.
Industry data show builder sentiment improved for the first time in 5 months. Gradually lower mortgage rates boosted buyer traffic, and the sales outlook improved a bit. That said, mortgage rates are 2 times higher than at the end of 2021, just before the Federal Reserve started tightening to stop inflation. There's more housing data this week. Tuesday, it's housing starts. Wednesday, existing home sales. Friday, new home sales. Vinny Del Giudice, Bloomberg Radio.
Again, crude oil up 2.1% as BP said it is halting all voyages through the Red Sea, the clearest sign yet that attacks on shipping in the region may disrupt flows. Shares of oil companies are higher. ExxonMobil up 1.6%. ADRs of BP up 1.3%. Chevron now up by 0.3%. Recapping, Dow just turned negative. S&P up 0.5. That's a Bloomberg Business Flash.
You're listening to Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
It's not too often you hear the White House reach out to condemn what it's hearing from Republican presidential candidates, but that is what happened over the weekend in the case of Donald Trump. Welcome back to the fastest show in politics. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano along for the ride as the White House issues a statement about the words we heard from the former president at a rally over the weekend, the poisoning the blood of our country. You heard this. Here's Donald Trump from over the weekend. I'll grab that for you while I read the White House statement, echoing the grotesque rhetoric of fascists and violent white supremacists and threatening to oppress those who disagree with the government are dangerous attacks on the dignity and rights of all Americans, on our democracy, and on public safety. A statement from a White House spokesperson reads, noteworthy, after we heard from Donald Trump, remember we talked about the vermin comment, the poisoning blood comment came from just over the weekend. Here he is.
We got a lot of work to do. You know, when they let, I think the real number is 15, 16 million people into our country, when they do that, we got a lot of work to do. They're poisoning the blood of our country. That's what they've done. They poison mental institutions and prisons all over the world, not just in South America, not just the 3 or 4 countries that we think about, but all over the world. They're coming into our country from Africa, from Asia, all over the world.
Used the same phrase on social media over the weekend. Rick and Jeannie, curious to hear your take, because Jeannie, some would tell you he just does this to get us talking about him, and that's partly how he managed to get elected the first time around. Does the White House have a job to stamp out this kind of, I don't know what you would even call it here, racist rhetoric?
Yeah, Nazi rhetoric. This comes a month after he called left-leaning Americans vermin, another phrase borrowed from the Nazi era. And yeah, the White House has a responsibility to come out strongly against this kind of rhetoric, as we all do. What was really striking to me was, we ended this hour of the show on Friday. You brought up the issue of the former First Lady in a rare public appearance going to talk about the issue of immigration, eloquently so. And he comes 48 hours after that with these horrific statements. And, it's mind-numbing to think that he is leading in the polls as much as he is. But I do think that it is incumbent on the press and all Americans to speak out about this kind of language and who this person is that wants to hold the White House again.
He said that, though, to get us to talk about it, right, Rick? This is, he knew the poisoning the bloodstream, whatever the phrase here, that's going to get people all worked up. And that's the game that he plays.
Well, yeah, I'm not even sure how much of this is for media consumption, but it is certainly for the consumption of the voters who he has, sort of plugged into as feeling oppressed and, left out and victimized. I mean, it's right out of the Joseph Goebbels, speechwriting camp. And the reality of it is it works with a lot of people, and it hasn't really paid. He hasn't paid much of a price. I mean, as Jeannie said, I mean, look at his numbers. I mean, he's sustained throughout all of this a pretty static number within the Republican primary, and in the general election, when we look at the Bloomberg Battleground survey that just came out last week, he's actually inching up with Hispanics and African American men. So, you wonder, are they listening to anything he says? I'm impressed that now the White House has decided, we've got to actually start paying attention to these things and calling him out on it. And I think that's certainly a step in the right direction for their campaign, but, maybe even too late to really have an impact.
So just quickly, Rick, is it possible to win the Republican nomination right now in this current state of the party without the dog whistle?
Sure. I don't think it actually is helping him. It's just, sustaining a base that heretofore haven't had anywhere else to go but to him. The reality is, if he's not the nominee, these same voters will vote for whoever the Republican nominee is because they're going to think they're better than Joe Biden. And if Joe Biden wins, maybe it's because he was able to cut into some of these, white rural, union members who used to be Democrats. I mean, maybe there's an angle there. But the reality is they're not going to vote for Joe Biden. So whoever the Republican nominee has a chance of getting their votes, regardless of what kind of rhetoric they use. And obviously, you would think they wouldn't use this kind of hot rhetoric.
Jeannie, we were talking about the border a couple of minutes ago and whether we're going to get to a deal here in Washington. Donald Trump said over the weekend, the migrant surge at the border is a, quote, military invasion, unquote, as he went through the whole poisoning the bloodstream. Would an actual deal on the border that this president's fingerprints, Joe Biden's fingerprints would be on, help to kind of cancel out this type of rhetoric if, in fact, these are the two nominees?
I believe it would. This is going to be a very close election, regardless of who the nominees of each party end up being. And the reality is that as deplorable as his language is, it's the same language he used when he came down the elevator in Trump Plaza in 2015 and announced his candidacy, the same disgusting language. But he is pointing to the reality that we have an insecure border. We've had it for decades through Republicans and Democratic presidents. Everybody is frustrated by it, and yet Washington is unable to address it. And so certainly if we get a deal and that deal is meaningful and we get some type of much needed immigration reform, that would be an enormous step forward, because some people listen to this language and say, yeah, it's just Trump being Trump. But the reality is we need immigration reform. And that second part is right.
Be amazing if we actually got it. Jeannie Shanzano and Rick Davis, our signature panel here on the fastest show in politics, and we're just getting started. Some final thoughts ahead from Rick and Jeannie, and we'll bring you up to date on world and national news. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. We're glad you're with us. This is Bloomberg.
Your company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. Nikola founder Trevor Milton has been ordered to spend 4 years behind bars for lying to shareholders about the electric truck maker's progress. SunPower plunged the most in 15 years after the rooftop solar installer said it has breached a credit agreement, and there is, quote, substantial doubt about its ability to continue operating. Shares of the company, which is majority owned by French oil major Total Energy, are now slumping 33%. According to a regulatory filing, SunPower said a subsidiary has defaulted under its credit agreement due to a delay in third-quarter financial statements. VF Corp says it is working to restore its ability to fulfill orders following a cyber attack. And with more, here's Bloomberg's Steve Rappaport.
Charlie, the company has not determined the full scope of the incident. In a filing, the parent of North Face, Vans, and Timberland said unauthorized occurrences were detected on a portion of the company's information technology system last week. VF Corp said the hacker stole personal and other data. The company says it's working with external cybersecurity experts and has shut down some systems. In that filing, VF said the disruption had caused and is reasonably likely to continue to have a material impact on operation. Retail stores around the world are still open for business, and VF says customers can place e-commerce orders, but fulfilling them has been affected. Charlie?
And that's Steve Rappaport, VF Corp, down by 7.1%. Apple will stop selling the Watch Series 9 and Ultra 2 in the U.S. just before Christmas as a result of a patent dispute. Those are our top stories. This is Bloomberg.
You're listening to Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
We are live from Washington. We'll add Kaylee Lyons to the conversation in just 5 minutes. First, we'll bring you up to date on world and national news. For that, we turn to Scott Carr in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington. Hi, Scott.
Good afternoon, Joe. Reports say shipping in the Red Sea's ground to a halt with oil tankers idling and containers being rerouted around Africa. Two European oil and gas giants have said today that their tankers would have to avoid the waters off the coast of Yemen, an unavoidable waypoint for ships who use the Suez Canal to cut between Europe and Asia. They joined major container shippers who pulled out of the area last week as Iran-backed Houthi militants stepped up attacks in support of Hamas. South Korean officials say North Korea fired a short-range ballistic missile into the sea Sunday. The launch follows talks between Washington and Seoul over the weekend. Bloomberg's John Hershkovitz has more from Tokyo on the nature of those talks. He says the inclusion of a nuclear sub in recent military drills may have drawn the response today.
These talks are used to deter North Korea from using nuclear weapons. And what the U.S. has done is it sent its military assets to the region in a show of force that demonstrate if North Korea were to try to launch an attack, there would be an overwhelming response. The most recent part of this, the show of deterrence, is a U.S. nuclear-powered submarine that arrived in the South Korean port of Busan over the weekend.
It's Bloomberg's John Hershkovitz. A powerful storm continues to drench the East Coast. It's knocked out power to hundreds of thousands. Strong winds and heavy rains produced flash flooding from the mid-Atlantic to New England. Parts of New Jersey, New York, and Connecticut remain under flood alerts as the storm moves up toward Canada. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Scott Carr. Back to you, Joe.
Hi, Scott. I appreciate it. As we make our way into a rather stressful time of year, I'm taken by the words of the Surgeon General, who's been very concerned. Well, he's concerned about a lot of things that challenge our health, but one that you don't hear enough about is his epic effort to combat loneliness, which Vivek Murthy says is as deadly as smoking. In fact, has drawn that comparison before, in that it could kill you if not treated properly. Here he is.
The increase in the risk of premature death that we see with loneliness and isolation, with social disconnection, is on par with what we see with smoking daily.
And so a great story at Politico as he was talking to a room full and delivered his 45-second tool to combat loneliness. He had everybody take out their cell phones. That's supposed to be bad, right? It is, in fact, the root of so much loneliness in this country. The fact that we're addicted to phones and social media, which you don't need me to explain to you. And he said, we're going to use technology for good here, and tasked everyone with writing and sending a message to someone they were grateful for in 45 seconds. They even dimmed the lights, played music, and talked about the ripple effects that might have on others and you as the message sender. And so with some final thoughts from our panel, I thought we would go there with Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano. Jeannie, you're surrounded by young people, but it's us old folks as well who deal with this time of year. And I wonder what you think of the 45-second tool.
I think it's a great idea. I'm going to be messaging you, Rick, right away in 45 seconds to say I'm grateful to you.
Well, I'm grateful to you guys as well. Now, Rick, I think of as just a professional networker. Rick, you're surrounded by people all the time. Maybe this is something that you can just do without thinking about it. But for some, it takes a little bit of work. Does this sound like a smart path to take?
Yeah, I think all these ideas that improve people's mental health are positive. I'll never be lonely as long as my friend Bindi is by my side throughout the day. So I must admit, I don't have the problem that a lot of people speak about, but anything that can help, buy a dog.
That's the best. We love Bindi, by the way. Can we all say that for those of us on YouTube right now? Let's hear it for Bindi this Christmas and New Year's. Great thanks to Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano. They'll be back tomorrow on the fastest show in politics. Kaylee's coming in next because hour 2 of Sound On starts right now.
Now, from our nation's capital, this is Bloomberg Sound On.
Two major stories that we're following here developing before our eyes.
What does it say about Trump's influence on the Republican Party?
What can the Biden administration do on its own to support Israel?
Bloomberg Sound On. Politics, policy, and perspective from D.C.'s top names.
The Republican caucus is at war with itself.
Members of Congress would have a press conference every day if somebody would cover them.
There is bipartisan support for Israel.
This is one of the big ones we only see once every decade or 2 decades in the Middle East.
Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines on Bloomberg Radio.
The Secretary of Defense is back in Tel Aviv. The CIA director is back in Qatar. Welcome to hour 2 of Sound On. As the Pentagon advises Israel on winding down military operations in Gaza in person, and the CIA works toward another potential truce to release more hostages. All this as Houthi attacks shut down shipping in the Red Sea. We have a lot to talk about, including the economic impact of the latter. We'll do that with Jenny Welch from Bloomberg Economics, and we'll talk with Nick Wadhams from our national security team. Don't hold your breath for a deal on the border. Even as negotiators continue their work, we'll discuss with Mick Mulvaney, the co-founder of the Freedom Caucus, former acting chief of staff of the Trump White House, is with us at the table, along with Kaylee Lines, too. And it's all after a look at Wall Street. Let's get started right there, right now, with the markets and Charlie Pellet. Hey, Charlie.
Hi, thank you very much, Joe Matthew. Happy Monday. You alluded to what's going on in the energy markets, specifically crude oil. West Texas Intermediate up now by 1.6%, $72.60 for a barrel of WTI. We've got Brent up 1.9%, 78 even right now. A lot more on oil coming up right here on Sound On. Stocks have kicked off the trading week on a positive note, boosted by a burst of deals and ignoring pushback from Fed officials who are trying to rein in bets that rate cuts could come as early as March. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all advancing now. S&P up 26, gain there of 0.6%. The Dow up 19, up by about 0.1%. NASDAQ Composite Index up 105, now up by about 0.7%. NASDAQ 100 Index up 0.7%. 10-year yield 3.95% with a 2-year that's yielding 4.45%. Spot gold up $7 the ounce to $2,026, up 0.4%. Crude worth repeating, up now 1.5%, $72.56 right now for a barrel of WTI. Bottom line here, stocks higher across the board. Jared Woodard is head of research committee at B of A Securities. He says, yes, time now to take some chips off the table.
The gains from this pivot by the Fed are fully reflected in the market. I mean, never mind the Santa Claus rally. This market, bonds and stocks alike, have trimmed the tree. They popped the champagne cork for New Year's. They booked a ticket for summer vacation. They're so far ahead of what the economic fundamentals would suggest. If anything, this is a great point to start taking profits and look for alternative positioning for next year.
And you can hear more of that conversation on the Surveillance Podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcast. Deal-making news on this Monday. Nippon Steel buying United States Steel for $14.1 billion to create the world's second-largest steel company and the biggest outside China, with a key role in supplying American manufacturers and automakers. U.S. Steel shares surging now by 27.2%. ADRs of Nippon Steel, they are down 4.4%. Again, recapping, stocks higher. S&P up 26, up 0.6%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Right, Charlie, thank you. Welcome to hour 2 of Bloomberg Sound On. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington alongside Kaylee Lines. Kaylee, it's great to see you. We've got a lot of news flying and what really would normally be an extremely quiet period of time, but it all began with Chuck Schumer deciding to keep the Senate here.
Yep.
And they don't have a lot to show for it right now.
Yeah, kept them here for what could have been a good reason if they were voting on a deal when it comes to the supplemental package, if they had reached an agreement when it comes to these border security measures over the weekend, as was the goal. It just doesn't seem that goal was met. So maybe they won't be voting on that this week. Maybe the FAA reauthorization.
Well, I guess they do have to do that.
Potentially.
Maybe a couple of 4 stars.
So some business still to take care of.
None of them are happy to be here. It seemed to be a pretty good weekend, though, for the trio, Sinema, Murphy, Langford. They just need more time.
Right.
And no one should be surprised by that. I feel like we all got way ahead of ourselves on this, talking about making a generational deal in a matter of days. Either way, this is not great for Ukraine. As we discussed last hour, Bloomberg News got hold of a letter from the Pentagon that makes it clear, December 30, we're out. We're just out. There's no other money coming until Congress gets this done. But that includes Israel as well, which doesn't quite get as much talk lately.
Well, maybe because there isn't that much opposition to the idea of Israel getting more funding. There is opposition to Ukraine, which is why many Republicans have made further Ukraine aid contingent on the border security issue. Israel just happens to be looped in with that because the supplemental request the White House made originally had all of these things together.
Yeah, there's a lot of tentacles here on that supplemental, but there is quite a bit of news around Israel, and of course it's got its own controversy in the way that this is being handled by Israel and the support that the White House is giving. Lloyd Austin is back in the region. He's in Tel Aviv right now, talking again about protecting civilian life. Here's the Secretary of Defense.
Democracies are stronger and more secure when we uphold the law of war. And as I've said, protecting Palestinian civilians in Gaza is both a moral duty and a strategic imperative. So we will continue to stand up for Israel's bedrock right to defend itself. And we will also continue to urge the protection of civilians during conflict and to increase the flow of humanitarian aid into Gaza.
General C.Q. Brown with him as well, which is interesting to see on this trip as the Secretary extends the deployment for the USS Gerald Ford. And we've got Nick Wadhams at the table here to give us a little bit more on this. Nice to see you, sir.
Hey.
Runs our national security team. You guys must have been working all weekend. I mean, it's just been
busy.
Quite a flurry of news here. I don't know what jumps out to you because we're going to ask you about Ukraine as well. With what's happening right now in Israel, what does it mean to have Lloyd Austin show up with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs at a moment like this?
Well, that clip you played of Austin, I thought is fascinating because he has that line, democracies are stronger when they uphold the laws of war, which is sort of classic Austin where he doesn't want to make a lot of waves, but why is he saying that? Well, obviously they have fears that Israel may not be upholding the laws of war to the degree that it is. This bombing campaign has resulted in such a high number of civilian deaths. So he is moderating his tone. Before he went to Israel, he had said basically Israel needs to be careful to not turn a tactical gain into a strategic loss. And he did say that they're not going to dictate to Israel how to run their war. But obviously what you are seeing here is some effort by the U.S. to shape the nature of this conflict and sort of steadily push Israel to have an end game in sight.
Well, and perhaps to lower the intensity of the fighting currently in Gaza as well. It just begs the question, Nick, as to whether this is ringing deaf to Israel's ears, how much this is actually being heeded by Netanyahu and his government.
Well, I mean, and it's a great question because there are two things happening here. One, you have this message from the U.S. administration, but then, as you mentioned, I mean, the money is tied up in Congress a little bit, but the U.S. has given no indication that it's going to be willing to condition its aid on any changes by Israel. So you have them saying this on the one hand, but then continuing to provide military armaments, so sending a very strong message that for all of their concerns, they are going to continue to give Israel the weaponry it needs, including these 2,000-pound JDAM bombs that, and artillery shells that are very difficult to make pinpoint strikes with. I mean, the whole point of them in a lot of ways is to be, have a fairly wide blast radius. So a couple of conflicting messages there.
CIA Director Bill Burns back in Warsaw today. I said Qatar. He's actually meeting with Qatar in Warsaw, if I understand that right, which is kind of a big deal, isn't it? That the Israeli spy agency is there as well. That's how we got to a ceasefire, and I know I'm not supposed to call it that, or a truce, the pause.
Humanitarian pause, yeah.
That brought 100 hostages back to their families. Could that happen again?
Well, these are going to be much thornier discussions because previously it was, basically children, women who were not IDF soldiers, and now really the understanding is that the only people left are essentially IDF soldiers, and so those conversations are going to be a lot more tense. But that was the avenue after that 7-day ceasefire or humanitarian pause collapse. That was really the avenue that the U.S. and a lot of others saw as the sort of starting point for efforts to get to a broader pause, broader sort of cessation of the conflict. So I think they see that as the route, but they also really believe, okay, listen, we got to do more for these hostages. Bill Burns really just the point man for this for the U.S. government.
Well, and while the U.S. has the concern about the hostages potentially, and of course the concern more broadly about how Israel is conducting themselves in this conflict with Hamas, you also heard from Lloyd Austin today the effort the U.S. is trying to engage in the Red Sea with escalating strikes by Iran-backed Houthi rebels against merchant vessels in the region. You've had a number of companies now saying that they're not going to use that waterway for the time being, and we're going to have more on this in a moment. But just from the U.S. perspective, how hard is it to get other allies on board with that, knowing the Saudis and the Emiratis might not handle this the same way?
Well, I think, they do have military assets there. The question is how far they push it. So I think you're going to see in the next day or two, the administration has really been telegraphing that that they are going to have some sort of an announcement of a maritime task force, which is basically repurposing a lot of the military assets that are already in the region. The bigger question is, what do they do about the Houthis in Yemen? Do they launch preemptive military strikes against them? They've shown no reluctance to do that against Iran-backed forces in Syria and Iraq. Do they actually do that in Yemen? I think that's where you're seeing some of the more resistance. That's the big question that they're going to have to face because, obviously the risk there is that the war spreads, becomes a regional conflict. So those are the conversations that are happening right now.
Nick Wadhams, great to see you. Great reporting. As always, thanks for coming back to see us at the table. He runs our national security team here, and they do such a great job. Kaylee, we heard from Lloyd Austin, again, in Tel Aviv, on the matter of these Houthi attacks. Here he is.
These attacks are reckless, dangerous, and they violate international law. And so we're taking action to build an international coalition to address this threat. And I would remind you that this is not just a U.S. issue. This is an international problem, and it deserves an international response.
It's an international problem for sure. We talk about BP, Maersk, Euronav, now all pausing shipments through the Red Sea. That's a long way around Africa if you need to do it that way.
Yeah, you really have to think about this on the map here. About 12% of global seaborne trade goes through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. So if they can't go that way, it has to go the long way around, which adds miles, potentially could delay these shipments, snarl supply chains even further, and potentially could have a serious economic consequence. So for more on that, we want to bring in Jenny Welch now. She is Bloomberg Economics Chief Geoeconomics Analyst, literally the perfect person to talk to about this issue. Just how bad could this get if it's an extended period of time where vessels are not going through the Suez?
Well, thanks so much again for having me on. As you noted, it's definitely going to increase some time for shipments as well as shipping rates. And it's about a 40% increase to go around the southern tip of Africa versus going through the Red Sea, through the Suez Canal. So I think that's definitely a concern for the near term. I will say, I think over the medium to long term, what we're likely to see is the United States and other stakeholders in the region stepping up efforts to try and add more security to the Red Sea and hopefully get maritime shipping back on track.
A lot of this is apparently based on ignorance. The Swan Atlantic vessel that Houthi rebels say they attacked loaded with oil apparently did not have an affiliation with the Israelis that was believed. Are they just throwing drones at anything that comes through at this point?
Yeah, I think that's the concern, is that their attacks might not be so discriminate, right? That they have said that they're going to be targeting any vessels with ties to Israel that are making berths there, that are otherwise transporting resources there. But the attacks that we've seen earlier today indicate that that might not be perfect information coming in. And I think for a lot of these vessels, there's concerns about where the attacks are going to be coming from. Is it going to be drones? Is it going to be missiles from land? When, is it going to be crafts approaching them and seeking to seize control of the vessel? now that there's more information out there, hopefully that helps some of these vessels that are still trying to make that transit prepare. But I think a lot of them are going to be taking the risk-averse approach of going around until, again, the security situation finds a little bit more of a footing.
Which it seems you think will happen in the medium to long term. But what exactly is that? Is that months? Is that potentially, as long as this conflict goes on, you need more resolution in terms of what's actually happening with Hamas for there to be more stability when it comes to what the Houthis are doing? How are you thinking about this?
I think definitely a shorter time frame than waiting for the ongoing conflict in Gaza to wrap up. Right now, what we're looking at is Secretary Austin is in the region. He's looking to hold a meeting tomorrow with other regional ministers to talk about possibly a reinvigoration of a maritime security task force, getting more security vessels in the region. Already we have a lot of U.S. Navy vessels there that have proven to be pretty efficient with taking down Houthi strikes, whether they're drones or whether they're missiles, but they can't cover everything on their own. And so I think this is an effort to try and coordinate and collaborate with other regional security partners to cover more of that ground, figuratively speaking, and try and provide more security to the vessels that are still transiting through that area.
When we consider, and I see crude oil, at least Texas is up about $1.5% a barrel here, 72.5. The economic impact would be oil largely in the outset of this conflict. But now we're talking about goods of any sort if it's a supply chain crisis. Is that so-called lower risk route around the Horn actually a secure path for these ships to take? There are no other potential interferences they would face other than time?
I think the main concern is time, and the main concern is probably insurance costs going up as well for any ships that are still transiting through, and the adjustments that are required for that, right? These adjustments are taking place right now in real time. In a couple of weeks, markets might sort of adjust to this new reality, this new norm. So I think that's the main concern is those set of costs. And I think from the perspective of, other maritime shipping concerns, certainly there's concerns with the Panama Canal having lower water usage rates at this point, and that delaying shipping as well. So there's just a lot of concerns out there about what the future will be, and I think that's driving up some of these costs. Once we start to get a better grasp of what's actually happening, we might see more of a normalization.
I'm looking at the map here, Jenny, because we're talking here obviously about the Suez Canal and the Red Sea, but when this conflict first broke out, there was a lot of question around the Strait of Hormuz, because it's an Iran question here. There was the issue of maybe if sanctions went back on, because you see Iran actually closing up that choke point in particular. I just wonder how much potential there is for it to get worse in this region where so much trade goes through, not just through the Suez.
I have to say it can always get worse. I think at this point in time, we're not seeing any of those risks pointing towards either Iran shutting it down or the Houthis starting to switch tactics to targeting oil-producing facilities as they have been doing in recent years. Where we'd start to get concerned, and this is some of the concerns we're seeing from other regional partners, is if the counter-Houthi campaign starts to stir up some of those tactics that they've seen in the past. I think the thing guarding against that is we've seen Saudi Arabia and Iran really work to kind of normalize ties. That might provide more of a constraint on Houthis resuming some of their prior tactics of targeting, in particular, Saudi facilities.
I'm spending time with Jenny Welch, who is our geopolitical advisor at Bloomberg Economics. And we've got an important letter here that Bloomberg obtained from the Pentagon with regard to Ukraine, which we also wanted to ask you about while you were here. We have an actual date now. We knew it would be around the end of the year after what we heard from the budget director at the White House. But December 30, the accounts will be empty. So that's drawdown. That's also security spending. We're flat out before we even get into the new year here. But Jenny, we also just saw roughly $1 billion go out of the Defense Department to buy new weapons and equipment for Ukraine. Is that kind of a bridge to what would be potentially a funding deal in January?
It's a little bit of a bridge. I think the challenge here is twofold. They might have a little bit of money left to send additional arms to Ukraine, and they have this little bit of money left to invest in future production. But the challenge when it comes to weapons production is this is a long lead time sort of item. You need to be making investments now in the hopes that in the medium to long term, you'll produce outputs. And with the defense industry already under a lot of strain between Ukraine, Israel, and all the other global demands, and with U.S. stocks already pretty low, first with Ukraine, now with Israel, you need a lot of investment. And that's what the Biden administration's emergency funding request is really a huge piece of it, about $34 billion, was really just about injecting that into the U.S. defense industry base, not even giving the aid to other partners. It's really about increasing our own productivity. And the problem is the more you delay that, the longer it takes to reach that full capacity.
So when we're thinking about the economic implications here, it really is an economic blowback against the United States specifically if this doesn't happen, right? Because that's that's lost output.
Or at least a delay in it. Hopefully, when the Congress comes back into session after the new year, they'll be able to find some sort of resolution and get some of that money out the door, but it's a delay in it. And again, with an industry that works on long lead times, the longer you delay, the longer it really takes to get up. It's not a quick turn sort of thing.
Melinda Herring brought this up last hour from the Atlantic Council. You introduced us to the DIB as a concept. She went a little bit further, said it's not only the U.S., the Europeans promised Ukraine that there would be investments in the manufacturing chain of these weapons. And sometimes these are the dumb weapons. These are the shells that they can't get made. So if neither the U.S. nor the Europeans are doing this, what good is the money, I guess, if we can't make anything with it?
I mean, that's a great question, and that's a huge question when it comes to the investments. You need to be thinking forward now about the sorts of things that you're going to need to deliver, not just to Ukraine, which, as you noted, needs that 155 millimeter artillery shells, technology that's existed for decades, but we just have run out of them. But Israel also needs it. A lot of other partners around the world are in demand for these weapons, and the DIB can only produce so much at this point in time.
Amazing. We love talking to you. Thank you for coming in with a lot of important stories in the air here. Jenny Welch from Bloomberg Economics. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons. Let's bring you up to date on the markets. For that, let's turn to New York. Charlie Pellet has an update on trading for us. Hey, Charlie.
Well, hello there, Joe Matthew. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ in the green. Back to work Monday after 7 weeks of gains for the U.S. stock market. We are up again. S&P right now up 26, gain there of 0.6%. Nikola founder Trevor Milton has been ordered to spend 4 years behind bars for lying to shareholders about the electric truck maker's progress. Dow Industrials up 8 right now, little changed, up less than 0.1%. S&P, as I mentioned, up 0.6%. NASDAQ 100 index up 0.8%, higher by 131 points. The NASDAQ Composite Index is up 112. That is a gain right now of about 0.8%. 10-year yield 3.95% with a 2-year 4.45%. Gold up 0.4% at $2,027 the ounce, while West Texas Intermediate crude oil is up 1.3%, $72.32 for a barrel of WTI. A consortium backed by Insight Partners and Clear Lake Capital has agreed to acquire software company Alteryx in a transaction valued at about $4.4 billion. Shares of Alteryx, they are lower by 1.9%. And Apple's going to stop selling the Watch Series 9 and Ultra 2 in the U.S. just before Christmas as a result of a patent dispute over the blood oxygen center. Again, recapping, stocks are higher. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, all in the green. S&P up 0.6%. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Okay, Charlie, we thank you. Thanks for keeping us up to date. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington alongside Kaylee Lyons. And as I mentioned, Kaylee, there are a couple folks left. A couple senators are knocking around. Yeah. They were hoping to get to a deal on the border. It's looking like that would take a Christmas miracle. But there are a couple of other things they might need to get done. What do we have? Military promotions in the air?
11 of them, yes.
4 stars. This brings us back to the Tuberville blockade. And then there's the matter of the FAA reauthorization.
Which has to be done by year end.
Right. So it could be a pretty short menu by the time they're done.
Well, they could do an extension on FAA, which is what I hear they're going to do, right?
Hey, Mick Mulvaney's here.
Did you hear that voice?
Yeah, that was like a stealth introduction.
Is that, I can never tell the difference between radio and TV, so I pretend it's radio.
We can't either, because now they're all the same.
But Kaylee, I thought they could do an FAA extension until March or April by the end of the year, not a full reauth.
That's right.
Is that changed?
It would be a short-term kick it to next year. We'll figure it out then.
As they like to do here in Washington.
Mick Mulvaney cannonballs into the pool.
Co-founder of the
wasn't on
in the best way. I just thought we were chatting.
Of course, we don't. I mean, do we need to tell everyone every week?
No.
When we're acting.
No. I was chess club president in high school.
That's true.
Oh.
That's great.
Add that one to the resume.
I could learn a lot from you still, obviously.
There weren't a lot of members of the clubs.
We're not getting a deal this week, right? Can we just go beyond that?
When granted, anything can change at any time. When any politician tells you they know exactly what's going on, you can completely, mostly throw out the window. So when Lindsey Graham says, we're not going to get a deal this week, you might think, we might not get a deal this week. But if you get a deal tomorrow, they'll be the first ones to say, "Oh yeah, I always knew we were going to get a deal." So I always take that with a grain of salt. Sure. I just don't get the feeling, especially with the House gone now.
Yeah.
Can you imagine the new Speaker bringing the House back this week? Really, really, really hard to do.
Yeah.
But to have a deal they could come back to might be
correct.
Right.
But
helpful.
yeah, if your deadline, and how hard is the December 31st deadline? Really, I think that's
on
having a discussion
Ukraine.
about, on Ukraine funding.
Okay.
I've been watching the show.
Yeah.
From the green room, and I'm trying to articulate exactly. I try to say something without sounding like I'm being nasty. So I'm going to put myself in the role of OMB, who are the folks who came out and said the money runs out on December 30th. If I was still at OMB and Nancy Pelosi was in charge of the House, and I put out a press release that said the money for Ukraine is going to run out on December 30th, and she didn't want to give any money to Ukraine, she would completely ignore it as a partisan hack, sort of using my office to advance a political thing. She'd throw it away, is what it comes down to.
How about if it's from DOD?
Same thing.
Same letter?
Same thing.
Same
Especially
people.
if it's the Trump DOD, right?
Okay.
I mean, so is politics in everything? Yeah. Is the issue on funding Ukraine real? Yes. I'm not sure how seriously the members of Congress look at those deadlines and say, okay, is that a real deadline or is there a couple days in there? There's really not much difference, is there, between January 4th and December 27th? And they're probably right.
Well, except that Bloomberg obtained a letter from the Pentagon that says it's December 30th.
Yeah.
There's going to be no more money. So there is that. But I also feel like the Senate seems like it's taking the deadline more seriously, right? Chuck Schumer kept people around. These negotiators are still in the room. They're talking to the White House. Should the House be involved in these conversations if ultimately this is going to be a bill the House has to pass too? I just wonder if everyone's going to work so hard to come to a deal and then not all parties agree to it.
Yeah, I think in a perfect world that would be the way it works. Keep in mind, Washington doesn't function properly right now, so I mean that's not what I don't get the impression that is happening. Are they communicating? Certainly. Is this a four corners sort of a group of 8 combination of the House and the Senate talking about it? No, they're not. But that's not as partisan as it is institutional. You've covered this a long time. Regardless of which parties are in charge of the House and the Senate, there's still that institutional tension between those two bodies. And the Senate, when they cut a deal, are going to expect their deal to pass. And the House, when they cut a deal, is going to expect their deal to pass, right? But it never happens like that. So should they be doing that? Yeah. Are they? Probably at a very low level, but clearly this is not an equal discussion between the House and the Senate. And does that mean that it's going to take longer? Yes, it does.
And everyone's afraid to get jammed by the other chamber. Right. What do you make of this revelation that Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, is now communicating regularly with Donald Trump? Would you expect that to be the case? And how much can the former president thumb the scale on this?
Oh, the second question is really interesting. The first question is not. Yes, it makes complete sense for the Speaker of the Republican House of Representatives to be speaking to the de facto leader of the party.
Closest thing to the standard bearer.
Exactly, and the likely nominee. That, in fact, if they weren't having the conversation, we'd be asking probably harder questions. Whether or not Trump could put his thumb on the scale depends on whether or not, in part, he wants to. I'm not sure he has a position on this yet, and Trump won't take a position if he's not there yet. Yeah. So I'm not sure I don't know where he is on funding Ukraine. My guess is he's against it, but he's for funding the border and for funding support for Israel. So, it might be one of those things that doesn't fall neatly in any package. Do I think he could put the thumb on the scale with a couple of members? Probably. Are those the members?
He doesn't want Joe Biden to get a deal on the border.
Yeah, unless it's a really, really good deal and he can take credit for it. Yeah. I mean, that's the beauty, right? If Donald Trump can deliver the votes to get the deal and it's a good deal, maybe. But you're right. The starting position, I'll agree with you, is that the last thing that Trump wants politically is for Biden to be able to declare a victory this close to the midterm, to the election.
Well, we also had the former president weighing in when we first thought the government was shutting down. He seemed to be encouraging the crowd that said, hey, shut it down. See what happens.
He had that chance a couple times when I was there.
Yeah.
And he had a budget director who really, really wanted him to shut the government down a couple times. And we did it once. You
sure did.
Indeed.
We signed a bunch of spending bills that I wish that we had not, and he wished he had not after he signed them.
Well, and we'll see if he has to weigh in again come January 19th, February 2nd, when we're dealing with potentially a two-tiered
5 minutes after Iowa.
Getting closer and closer to Iowa.
Government shutdown. To go back to this idea that Joe raised of Mike Johnson having really close communication with the former president, I wonder if the former president might ultimately be the best ally he had, because how many allies does he realistically have in Congress right now?
Talk about Mike.
Yeah.
Keep in mind, it's sort of, when Donald Trump got to Washington, I always said one of his greatest strengths was he didn't have any relationships in town. And one of the greatest weaknesses he had was he didn't have any relationships in town.
And the same is true of Mike Johnson.
Exactly. It can cut both ways. Mike does not have the baggage that McCarthy had, and bad experiences in the past, for example, with certain members. But he also hasn't been out there raising the money for the last 10 years, and he doesn't have that goodwill built up. So he can cut absolutely both ways. Again, come back to the threshold question. It would be strange for Mike Johnson not to be talking to Donald Trump. But I think that the fact that he's talking to him isn't really that remarkable.
So take us for a walk. What's your view here? I mean, do you have a kind of a path in your head about what the next month looks like? Because there's a lot that needs to get done.
Yes,
we're not going to shut down. We're going to get a border deal that makes all this happen.
I remember back when I used to campaign for a living, and people would say, "Oh, it's not." I hate that Washington isn't more bipartisan. And I'm like, no. The problem is it's too bipartisan. Because there's one thing that everybody can agree on.
We're getting emails on this.
I know, and that's spending more money. And that's what they will agree on. They will figure out a way to give everybody enough of what they want to pass a Ukraine funding bill, an Israeli funding bill, a Taiwan funding bill, and a border security bill. And they will keep the government open because the spending numbers will just keep going up and up and up until they buy enough votes.
Chip Roy's head will explode.
That's how you get 30.
I was going to say, not everyone wants to spend more money.
No.
You have members of the Freedom Caucus that are pushing for pretty draconian cuts.
Yeah. You don't get $33 trillion in debt by accident, and you don't get it with one party doing it to you. Both parties hold hand in hand to get you $33 trillion in debt. The only thing this town can agree on in a bipartisan fashion is spending more money.
So Bob Good's running the Freedom Caucus now, we understand. A good steward. He's not getting along with Kevin McCarthy, who we hear is going to try to primary him. What's the next year look like for the Freedom Caucus?
Oh, it's rough all over the place. It's going to be rough in the House. I've had folks call me about the Nancy Mace race down in South Carolina. I live in South Carolina still. I went home after I left Washington. And there are folks, trying to line up to run against Nancy, and there's folks asking me, who should run against Nancy. So
asking you to run again?
No. Who do I know? It's a different district. It's down in Charleston. Okay. Not that makes a difference, as you know. You don't have to live in your district. Little piece of political trivia. Exactly. There used to be 4 members of Congress who lived in one district in Wisconsin, but that's another story for another day. There's going to be a lot of internal bloodbaths over that. When Patrick McHenry, and I've not talked to Patrick, so I'm not giving away any private conversations. When Patrick McHenry announced he was retiring from Congress, to me that was the biggest red flag that the Republicans themselves think they are going to lose the majority. Wow. Because Patrick, even though he was term limited, technically, could have easily received an exemption to maintain his position as chairman of the House Financial Services Committee. So there's a guy that if he wins and they hold the majority, he's going to be financial services chairman, and he announces he's leaving. To me, that tells me that he doesn't think that we're going to keep the majority. And when you break it down and you talk about Republicans fighting against Republicans in certain districts, you talk about losing Kevin McCarthy and his ability to raise all that money, a lot of the things that are lining up to have a tough year for the House Republicans. Does Donald Trump make that better or worse? That's really sort of the unknown at this point. But right now, if you had to bet, you'd bet that the Republicans would struggle to keep the House, and that also doesn't breed a lot of goodwill in that building.
So you think it's not that people are deciding to retire because of dysfunction, but maybe they recognize the dysfunction is going to cost them?
It's a variety of things, right? There's so many of them, Gailey, that it's hard to sort of paint with a broad brush. Some of them are retiring to run for higher office. Some of them are retiring because they've been here forever. And then some are retiring because they might think they're losing the majority. Some of the time because it's just not fun anymore. And it really isn't. And are the people who are running for higher office saying, well, I wasn't going to run for higher office, but this place is so miserable, so why not take a chance at running for higher office? So it can be a combination of all things, but this is, when you walk into the building, and I'm in the building, not that much, but more than the average citizen, it's not friendly right now. And that's the members that's people intra-party, and it's not just Republicans. Democrats have their own issues. It's institutional, and it's across party lines. It's tough right now.
So much for the Christmas spirit.
Yeah.
Yes. Was it fun when you started?
Was it fun when I started?
Or has that just been your tenure?
I think things have certainly changed. I think that we've gone. It's the Vivek Ramaswamy phenomena and Vivek Ramaswamy is someone who came of age in politics during the Donald Trump era. So for someone who's only been involved in politics for 6 or 7 years, Donald Trump looks normal. Donald Trump can get away with what Donald Trump does because he's a unique thing. He's a black swan event, right? Yeah. But everybody else is out there thinking, well, if I act like Donald Trump, I'll be as successful as he is on both parties. And that's not the way that things are supposed to work, and it's the reason things aren't working.
Great to see you in person.
Oh, come on.
A week from today is Christmas, right?
I would have said something uplifting if you'd asked me.
Well, a week from today is Christmas, is it not? Well, we never ask uplifting. It is, wow.
It is.
Are you doing something great
a
for
week from
Christmas?
today. In fact, I just got asked to do television on Monday morning at 7 o'clock on News Nation. I'm like,
I'll set a timer.
Maybe that's one you
are we doing this? You guys aren't doing next Monday, I would
Not
think,
a chance,
right?
no. But I'll see you the week after that.
Good.
See you in the new year.
I just had a phone call about the new government in Argentina. We can do foreign policy next
all right,
week.
excellent. Wow. Okay.
It's called a deep tease, ladies and gentlemen.
That's a scoop, Scott Carr. We have to get World and National News with Scott Carr in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington. Hey, Scott.
Thanks, Joe. Southwest Airlines agreeing to a record-setting civil penalty over the holiday travel nightmare that it caused for millions of passengers last year. The Department of Transportation says the airlines agreed to pay a fine of $140 million. That's 30 times more than any other such previous fine. Shares in Apple have recovered a bit after falling by as much as 1.6% today after the company announced it will soon stop selling its Apple Watch Series 9 and Ultra 2 models following an International Trade Commission ruling. That was part of a long-running patent dispute around the Apple Watch's blood oxygen sensor technology. Global news 24 hours a day, and when you want it, with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Scott Carr, and this is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 2:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg, and this Business Flash brought to you by the Jewish Communal Fund. JCF helps you respond to crises swiftly. Open your JCF, a donor-advised fund, now to secure your tax deduction. Visit jcfny.org or call 212-752-8277, 212-752-8277. Stocks are now trading mixed. We've got the Dow in the red, lower a little change right now. The S&P holding on to a 25-point gain, up 0.5%. Back to work Monday, and got to keep in mind, we have seen 7 weeks of gains for the U.S. stock market. NASDAQ today up another 112, up by about 0.8%. The NASDAQ 100 index up 132 right now, up 0.8%. A retreat, little change, lower for the Russell 2000 index of small cap shares, down by about 0.1%. 10-year 3.95%. The 2-year this Monday 4.45%. Spot gold up 40 cents right now. 2027 on spot gold, while West Texas Intermediate crude is up 2.2%, 78.23 right now for a barrel of WTI. Bottom line here, stocks are higher. The Dow just turning higher, has been fluctuating up 4 points. As for the equity market backdrop, after last week's Jay Powell rally, Steve Chevron is head of multi-asset at Federated Hermes.
Pauses historically are the best environments for equities, much better than when the Fed's cutting. So if you have upside surprises to inflation that would react, if this Fed, after that press conference, had to go back and hike, then yeah, that would be really bad. But if it's strong enough data just to keep them on hold, frankly, that may be better than cuts, because they usually cut for a reason.
Oil, a major story today. Oil is gaining as BP said it is halting all voyages through the Red Sea. The clearest sign yet that attacks on shipping in the region may disrupt flows. Oil company stocks are advancing along with the price of crude. ExxonMobil up 1.6%. ADRs of BP up 0.9%. Chevron up now by 0.2%. Recapping, stocks are higher. S&P up 26, up by about 0.6%. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
You're listening to Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines on Bloomberg Radio.
Kaylee, you just wonder if there is anything Joe Biden can do to improve his ratings here, because the latest from Monmouth is just flat depressing if you're working at the White House or in the campaign.
All-time low approval rating, 34%, Joe.
Wow. 50% and under is underwater. This is like drowning.
This is quite underwater.
34%.
Yeah, and when you go into the actual policy issue part of this, 3 in 10 Americans say Biden is prioritizing the policy issues that matter most to them, aka 7 in 10 say he is not. It's not
security at the U.S.-Mexico border among the issues pulling the number down this far, as we spend the better part of this program talking about the lack of a deal on the border.
Which kind of underscores how the president may actually need this deal to come through, that the White House is going to have to give something somewhere, perhaps. The thing about it, though, Joe, is even if you have a lot of the electorate who would like to see this happen, is it going to make the progressive flank more angry then, and you lose some of them on that side? It becomes, I think, a difficult equation for the president to figure out.
Extremely. So this 34%, that's compared to 41% for Donald Trump at this time 4 years ago. And of course, we know that majorities of both parties don't want either of these gentlemen as their nominees. So this is a good way to start a race.
I guess so.
Laura Davison joins us at the table now. She does this all day as Bloomberg Politics editor, following the trail, and I'm glad to know that you're going to be with us in Iowa and New Hampshire when these numbers will actually start to take on a little bit more meaning, if not only on the Republican side, we'll have a better sense of, what might be the alternative to Joe Biden, because a lot of folks say these numbers don't matter until you have a credible campaign that he's running against, a foil.
There's a lot of discontent with polls. However, when you look at all of the polls, they are all directionally in the same place. You're seeing Trump at 50 or even 60% support in the Republican primary, and then you have Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis sort of fighting it out for number 2 and 3. Around 15%. So even if the polls are wrong, they have to be wrong by major magnitudes to suggest that that one of these candidates could beat Trump in an early state. They could come close, but beating would be a very, very tall feat.
Yeah, it would be very hard to do. It really is a competition for second, as we have so often been talking about, between really Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis at this point. And maybe things are getting even tougher for Ron DeSantis, as if the challenge of trying to catch up to Trump in the polls wasn't enough. He's also bleeding money and bleeding people. The super PAC.
That's right.
Specifically, Jeff Rowe is out of Never Back Down. How problematic is that potentially for DeSantis' candidacy?
That's really problematic. Jeff Rowe was really the mastermind behind Never Back Down. He had all of his people from his political strategy firm who were there running the day-to-day. And what we've seen over the past 3 or 4 weeks is basically everyone who was loyal to Rowe leave, and DeSantis bring his own loyalist into the super PAC. Right now, we don't know exactly how much money they have, but they have been bleeding money. There's been lots of calls that they need more money. The campaign itself is also having struggle raising money. And the campaign, can take checks of $3,000. The super PAC can take unlimited amounts, but it's really hard to convince people to give hundreds of thousands of dollars when you can't even get them to give $3,000. Wow. So this just really spells the problems that he has of getting people, retaining people, and having the operation on the ground, while Haley has all of that Koch network money coming in, boosting her campaign, while DeSantis is struggling on all these fronts.
He showed up on, of all programs this morning, Morning Joe.
MSNBC.
On the liberal MSNBC, not Friends. There was a time when he was barely doing Fox. He was like a Newsmax guy or something. And now the idea is to spread things out a little bit, not just ON and Newsmax or Fox, but talk to those who might also consider voting for you. And he was talking a big game about the ground game in Iowa. Here he is.
We're going to have the biggest organization and support going into a caucus that anyone can remember. That ultimately is what does it. I also think people here in Iowa and in New Hampshire, they expect you to come and answer their questions. They expect you to come and ask for their vote. And I think what Donald Trump will do, he'll parachute in for 45 minutes, an hour, give a speech, and then just leave.
Maybe that's what he should be doing, because apparently visiting all 99 counties doesn't matter, Laura.
And DeSantis has staked his entire campaign on Iowa itself. They started out with Never Back Down, and they were in this multi-state strategy, had this massive operation, had to do layoffs, and said, look, we're going to focus just on Iowa, and that's where we'll be able to make a big splash. So far in the polling, you haven't really been able to see that. He's had these high-profile endorsements from the Governor Reynolds, Bob Vander Plaats, a big evangelical leader, and nothing has seemed to make a difference for him, sort of something like Biden might be able to also identify as he's seeing the same struggle in the polls. So if he does not do well in Iowa, that essentially spells the end of his campaign. He's not polling high in New Hampshire. He doesn't have a strong base of support there. Then you go to South Carolina, which is Nikki Haley's home state. The calendar and the map is not friendly to him as he gets past Iowa. So that is sort of his make or break moment.
Okay, well, let's talk about New Hampshire then. If Ron DeSantis might be out after Iowa, essentially, and Nikki Haley, according to the polling we saw over the weekend, is at 29% to Trump's 44%, could she actually pull something off there? Is that what this number suggests if you were to take Ron DeSantis out, and who knows, maybe Chris Christie as well?
Chris Christie will be the key for Nikki Haley winning New Hampshire, if that's possible. Most of DeSantis' support will probably go to Trump, somewhere else, not Haley, but Christie and Haley supporters are very similar, and so it suggests that, if one of those were to drop out, they would pick up the supporters of the other, though Chris Christie has also made his campaign about New Hampshire, so it's unclear that he would necessarily drop out before you get there, but it would at least kind of give the pundits some math. Okay, if you add up, Nikki Haley's 20% plus, whatever Christie gets, that is she approaching somewhere near Trump, then, Iowa is South Carolina is a couple weeks later, and she could, potentially, this is the theory of her campaign, then go and start overtaking Trump at that point.
Be an incredible moment. If it were to happen. We remember what happened with Joe Biden when he left New Hampshire. People had written him off, and suddenly the entire field cleared by the time they got to South Carolina. Also, pretty funny to see the congressional approval numbers in here.
Just abysmal.
It's not just the presidential candidates. Chuck Schumer looking like a big shot with 21% approval. Mitch McConnell got 6%. So,
I didn't even know approval could be that low, to be honest.
If Biden's feeling sad about his numbers, he really just needs to look down Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
Everything is relative.
Listen, absolutely. All the other old guy. He might be able to relate. By the way, Mike Johnson, 17% with a favorable opinion. It's good to be the new guy, I guess.
I guess.
Laura, great to see you. You have your parka and everything ready for all that?
We got the mittens
Iowa.
and the whole kit and caboodle.
New Hampshire. I'm Joe Matthew with Kaylee Lines. This is Bloomberg.
Your company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. A patent dispute taking some of its best-selling devices off the market during the busy holiday season. Sales of the Apple Watch Series 9 and Ultra 2 will be halted on the company's online store December 21st and at its physical retail locations beginning on Christmas Eve. Adobe is walking away from its $20 billion acquisition of the startup Figma after clashing with regulators in Europe and the United Kingdom. And with more on that story, here's Bloomberg's Erica Herskowitz.
Charlie, Adobe will pay Figma a $1 billion termination fee. The companies say they saw no clear path to getting regulatory approvals from the European Commission and the UK's Competition and Markets Authority. Regulators had been reviewing Adobe's proposed purchase for more than a year, demanding multiple rounds of documents and other information from the companies. Adobe said that the CMA's proposed remedies to allow the deal to go forward were disproportionate, and the company refused to offer fixes. The acquisition would have been one of the largest takeovers ever of a private software maker and was a massive bet that more creative work will be done by small businesses and everyday users on the web, a market that Figma has rapidly seized. Charlie?
And that's Erica Herskowitz reporting. So the deal not happening. Adobe shares up 2.9%. SunPower plunging the most in 15 years after the rooftop solar installer said it has breached a credit agreement. Those were our top company stories. This is Bloomberg.
You're listening to Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines on Bloomberg Radio.
We're live from Washington, where we bring you world and national news now with Scott Carr. He's next door in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom. Hi, Scott.
Hey there, Joe. U.S. officials are saying passport processing times have returned to pre-pandemic levels just as the holiday travel rush gets underway. At the height of the pandemic, some were waiting up to 3 months to get their passport applications processed. The State Department says going forward, passport applications will be processed within 8 weeks for normal service and 3 weeks for expedited service. Southwest Air's agreed to pay a record-setting civil penalty over the holiday travel nightmare it caused for millions of passengers last year. The Department of Transportation says the airlines agreed to pay a fine of $140 million, 30 times more than any other such previous fine. Secretary Pete Buttigieg says the outsized penalty is mostly about sending a message to the industry.
This is not just about holding Southwest accountable for the holidays and plans that were destroyed a year ago, but also about setting a new precedent.
Southwest also ordered to create a fund to be used to provide travel vouchers to passengers whose flights may be delayed or canceled due to things beyond the airline's control. Some of the LGBTQ plus community are saying they're cautiously optimistic after the Catholic Church's announcement today it will allow same-sex couples to be blessed by the church. Advocates say the Pope's decision is a pretty big deal. The Vatican says the priests can give blessings if they are not given as part of a regular church ritual. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Scott Carr. Back to you, Joe.
All right, Scott, I appreciate it. Great to have Scott Carr along for the ride. And before we hand things back to New York, we have to mark this important occasion as we all wonder, or at least I guess I do, Kaylee, the extent to which Christmas movies play into people's celebration of the season. Growing up, it was like the biggest deal in the world. Charlie Brown's Christmas. You just did Frosty, right?
Frosty the Snowman, yes. Last night.
Busy.
Happy birthday.
Yes. And the one that debuted on this day in 1966, How the Grinch Stole Christmas.
One of the greats.
Yeah. I mean, that for me, that's, going to always have to be my favorite. Boris Karloff, the whole thing, the story that went behind it. And I read about this on Bloomberg Daybreak, of all places this morning. If you don't start your day with Daybreak, you're missing out. They've already moved it off of here, but it didn't come that easily. In fact, nobody wanted this weird Christmas animated story when it came along. That ended up becoming a cult favorite. And of course, it's been remade.
A million times.
Yeah. You do the Jim Carrey thing?
I do.
You do?
Well, yes, I do them both. You
Okay.
have to watch both.
Well, if you say so. Every Who down in Whoville liked Christmas a lot. And it makes you wonder what roast beast really tastes like.
But it is.
Absolutely. Chuck Jones. This is great stuff. That was 1966. To think that how well it has lasted the test of time, the fact that they can still play that every year is remarkable. Although, I'll go back on what I just said. Nobody plays it every year, right? You have to have like a streaming service or you have to own the thing or rent it to watch it.
Yeah. I just looked at Amazon Prime. It's $4.99 to rent.
Is that right?
Right?
No kidding. So I don't know who owns it. It's like an Apple Plus. Do they own all the Christmas movies at this point, I think?
I just had to find Frosty the Snowman last night on a random YouTube channel.
No kidding. You watched it on YouTube?
I watched it on YouTube.
Wow.
I've been trying to watch at least 2 Christmas movies a week because, to your point, Joe, this is how I get hyped up for Christmas.
Yes. Well, I mean,
I've watched Elf already.
These were broadcast events. Like you'd have it, you'd cut it out of the paper or the TV guide. That's how old I am, and put it on the fridge so you didn't miss it. Now you just sit down and kind of wind it up and do your thing, but you can't mess with the original. Yeah, James, CBS every year.
Mr. Grinch,
This is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine, plus global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenivek on Bloomberg Radio.
And a good Monday afternoon, everyone. Live from the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. We're streaming on YouTube and Bloomberg Originals. It's Monday, December 18th, 2023. Just a week until Christmas. I'm Tim Stenivek. Carol Masser is out today. U.S. stocks kicking off the week on a positive note. They've been buoyed by this burst of deals. Even as the Fed sought to sow doubts that aggressive interest rate cuts will materialize early next year, the S&P 500 is just about 1% away from reaching a record set back in January of 2022. Well, the NASDAQ 100 is, yes, at a new record. For more on this, let's get on over to Charlie Pellet for a business flash. Hey, Charlie.
Well, hello there, Santa's elves. Keep on going. The Grinch nowhere to be found with the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ 100 index, all pushing higher. Yes, could see some records with the S&P up 25 right now at 47.44. That is a gain right now of just about 0.5%. We have got the Dow up 27, higher by 0.1%. NASDAQ, the composite index, up 107. That is a gain there of 0.7%. The Russell 2000, though, there's the Grinch moving lower, down 1 point right now. Little change, down less than 0.1%. 10-year yield 3.95%. We have got the 2-year 4.45%, and spot gold right now up 0.3. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Hey, thank you so much for that update, Charlie Pellet. Really do appreciate it. Well, as you heard from Charlie just now, the markets do keep chugging along. The Fed's pivot is making every day a record breaker. But what if you've missed out? We've got a great roundtable, including John Authers and Elena Popina, stopping by in just a few minutes to help us make sense of all of this. And SpaceX is not the only game in town when it comes to launching thousands of tiny satellites. We've got a new project, Project Kuiper, from none other than the retail and cloud computing giant Amazon. And speaking of connectivity, later this hour, we're going to be joined by the CEO of one of the largest independent owners of shared telecommunications infrastructure in the world. In fact, we've got a trio of CEOs on the program today. We'll also be joined by the founder and CEO of FarmBox RX. It's a company that partners with healthcare providers and healthcare plans to make the delivery of fresh fruits and veggies covered interventions. And Wendy Thomas, the president and CEO of SecureWorks, is going to be back with us. Also, we're digging into a Bloomberg Business Week this week. From the magazine, lab-grown chicken becomes another expensive Silicon Valley mess, and how recently transplanted financial professionals are forging a new era of philanthropy across the Sunshine State. All this to come. First up, let's bring in our TV colleagues. Bloomberg's Countdown to the Close starts right now.
Countdown to the close. Bloomberg's comprehensive cross-platform coverage ahead of the U.S. market close starts right now.
This is the Countdown to the Close. Scarlett Fu and Katie Greifeld here with you. We are joined now by our colleague Tim Stenivek, who is on his own at Bloomberg Radio.
It's just me.
Hi, Tim.
Wow.
Hi, how are you guys?
Are you okay?
I'm fine.
Okay.
I'm doing well, yeah.
All right.
I think, yeah,
well,
we're
we
good.
missed your partner in crime, but we're glad you're able to make it.
I'm glad I get to check in with you every hour. You can kind of do this like wellness check, make sure I'm doing okay.
Yeah, talk you through it.
Okay, yeah, I appreciate that. Hey, I don't know what you guys have on your holiday list this year, the Christmas list. Do you have the new Apple Watch on your list?
I have the Apple iPhone that I'm hoping someone will get for me, but not the Apple Watch.
Okay, if you're listening, Santa Claus, Scarlett wants a new iPhone. Well, those who do want the new Apple Watch for Christmas, this is the Series 9 and Ultra 2 in the U.S. You better hope that whoever was going to go buy that for you, including Santa Claus, has already gone out and bought it, because the company's going to stop selling the latest version of that smartwatch here in the U.S. Guys, all of this comes down to a patent dispute, and that means the watches are going to be taken off the market during a really, really important quarter for Apple here in the U.S. It's this anticipated import ban of Apple Watch models that have this blood oxygen sensor on them. That sensor is at the center of a legal battle with Massimo Corporation, which also makes devices that do similar readings.
Yeah, so the devices, they will be removed from Apple's online store at 3 p.m. New York time on Thursday, so you can go and look at it, I guess, until then. But
you
Apple
can play with it at the Apple Store.
Exactly. Go touch it while you can. Apple said, of course, there will be no impact to watches already sold to customers, but
they're not going to confiscate them.
Exactly. You can keep it. It is a pretty amazing story. It's amazing to think that there will be people walking around with these watches on their wrist.
Yeah. Well, and fortunately, they're thinking, thank God I got my stuff done early. You know, I'm kind of grateful that I didn't do any of my holiday shopping yet because VF Corp, which is the owner of Vans and North Face, has seen some cyber incidents on its website, on its IT system overall, and some personal data was taken as a result. So if you were buying Vans for someone in your family, you better check to see if maybe your data has been breached.
It's not just Vans. It's North Face, Timberland, Dickies, Supreme, JanSport, and more. This is a Denver-based company. I was just going to say, Scarlett, I mean, I'm sure the closets in your home are filled with Supreme. I didn't know people could buy that stuff online. I thought you just like line up for it for the drops. Is that big in your house, Scarlett? Supreme?
Vans are, no, not Supreme.
Vans are, okay.
Yeah.
All right, maybe I'm dating myself here. I thought
Maybe you are.
I actually know what teenagers think is actually cool. Hey, this disruption though that we're talking about when it comes to these cyber threats, we're increasingly seeing this. And again, just like the Apple Watch news, it couldn't come at a worse time, Katie, for VF Corp. It actually comes on a day when we're seeing a new rules and disclosure requirements by the SEC all around cyber attacks that actually go into effect today. Wendy Thomas is the CEO at the cybersecurity company SecureWorks. She's going to be joining us a little bit later on the program to give us an idea of
you
how
said us,
publicly.
Tim.
Oh, us. She's going to be joining me.
Okay.
A little bit later.
On Bloomberg Radio, specifically.
Me and all my imaginary friends.
The royal we.
Yeah.
Well, that sounds like a great conversation because to your point, I mean, it's really been industry agnostic. You think about some of the big names this year, I believe Clorox, MGM, now VF Corp, falling victim to these cyber attacks. And for VF Corp, I mean, this is ongoing. The company hasn't yet determined the full scope of this incident, and it's going to show up in their earnings.
It's a good point that we should make that brick and mortar shoppers are unlikely to be impacted. So if you are desperate for some of those items, Timberland boots, North Face jackets, you can still go to the store and you won't be impacted. Just don't get it online.
Not really want people who waited to the last minute to do their holiday
true.
shopping.
No consolation there whatsoever.
Not at all. Hey, that's going to do it for now, but I will be back with you a little bit under an hour.
Royal we. It's okay.
Check in with me. I think I'm going to be okay. We'll be here live on TV, radio, and YouTube. Also on Bloomberg Originals, 4 p.m. for our Beyond the Bell coverage. That's when we take you through today's market close. We'll see y'all in a little while. On a positive note, or kicking the week off on a positive note, I should say, buoyed by a burst of deals, even as Fed officials are kind of spending the last few days, a little bit over the weekend, sowing doubts that aggressive interest rate cuts are going to materialize next year. Here are a few of them. Chicago Fed President Austin Goolsbee, Cleveland Fed President Loretta Mester, they were the latest to join a growing chorus of central bank officials tempering market optimism after their New York counterpart John Williams last week said bets on a March reduction were premature. The equity market and the bond market are kind of ignoring them. Hey, we got a great roundtable to kick off our program this afternoon. John Author is a senior editor for markets and a Bloomberg opinion columnist. Elena Popina is equity markets reporter for Bloomberg News. Both of them are here in the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. John, I want to start with you because your latest column talks about the really quick rally that we've seen and how, I don't want to throw out this term, but essentially the easy money has been made at this point. And if you're looking to buy right now, your big question is, what's going to happen over the next decade?
Arguably, yes. I mean, at the moment, the Fed, if we believe the dot plot, thinks there's going to be 3 cuts next year, which is more than they were saying before. And the Fed funds futures markets thinks there are going to be 6. So it's hard to see how you get even lower rates than are currently being priced in unless something happens to shock the Fed into cutting far more than it currently wants to, i.e. if there's a recession which messes up equities.
So what happens if there is a recession, the Fed has to cut more aggressively? What do we see from equities?
One would imagine past experience has been that pivots tend not to be great for equities because they are pivoting for a reason. Which is that the economy is in trouble. If you have a pivot, as in 2018, after the Christmas Eve massacre, when Jay Powell stepped back from.
I remember that.
And that was an unusual pivot in that was at a time when the economy wasn't in any particular trouble, and it just loosed the dogs of war. You had this fantastic rally the following year. That's obviously roughly what we've had again this time, because the Fed is very unusually getting worried about whether it should be cutting rates soon with growth at over 5% and unemployment at less than 4%, which is unusual. I don't see myself how the current rate forecast is, or the current implicit rate forecast is fulfilled, turns out to be accurate, unless the economy turns out to be much worse than is currently being predicted.
Elena Popina, come on in here. You are equity markets reporter for Bloomberg News. You joined us at the end of last week to give us an idea of what we saw when it came to week 7 of gains for the S&P 500. Since then, you've spoken to quite a few sell-side analysts. What have they told you about how they're thinking about not just the next few days and the remainder of the year, but also what happens next year?
Yeah, thank you, guys. It's a pleasure to be here. We are seeing quite a number of sell-side analysts boosting their target prices for 12 months from now. The ratio of upgrades to target prices to downgrades is now at the highest level since at least January 2022. That's the previous time the S&P 500 reached its all-time high. Now, whether or not analysts are just reacting to the stock market has gone up quite a bit in November and has gone up quite a bit in December so far is yet an open question. To John's point, there is quite a bit of a concern that there is a mismatch between what the dot plot shows and what markets are expecting in terms of the pace of rate cuts next year. But the positive sign is that the rally seems to be broadening out. For example, the equal-weighted S&P 500 index is on pace for its best year since April 2022 relative to the cap-weighted S&P 500. So it's not just the Magnificent Seven anymore. The laggards, the relative laggards like value stocks are trying to outperform. So it gives more momentum and more breadth to the rally. But then, yes, again, there can be an argument made that the rally has become quite a bit of an overextended. So we could be due for some kind of pullback after New Year's.
What does history tell us about these types of pullbacks, John? I mean, I know you're not a technical analyst here, but in your experience, and I should know you're also chief investment officer of Hindsight Capital, so you have an idea.
With whom I've been in contact quite a bit.
Okay, so we'll wait to hear about Hindsight Capital later this year. But but what has history told us about moves like this?
Generally speaking, when you get moves this dramatic, there is a risk actually of a melt up. I mean, in terms of what Elena was saying, the positive way to put it is that breadth has widened, which is good. The negative way to put it is that there's a dash for trash. So the meme stock index, the last time I checked, was up 40% in a month, something silly like that. Lots of
crypto's been high.
Yes, lots.
Kathy Wood's ARK Innovation ETF has had a great
and lots of small caps that really don't look in good financial shape in terms of their credit have rallied. Now that is a sign of breadth, but it's also a sign of, okay, let's just buy the really cheap stuff now because everything's going to rip. The scenario that worries me, because again I might be over applying what's happened in my experience, my career, is LTCM.
Long-term capital
in '98, yes, which was, I think, the significant, the great era of monetary policy in since Volcker. And for those who don't know, LTCM was this huge hedge fund that began to melt down, got caught on the wrong side of all its trades after Russia defaulted in August of '98. The Fed organized, more or less forced all its banks, its creditors, to agree a bailout which didn't actually involve public money, which matters a lot at the time. The credit market stayed becalmed, and so Greenspan cut rates. And the most palpable turn in sentiment in a day I've ever witnessed was the day that Greenspan cut rates between meetings without warning on a Thursday afternoon. And I think bank stocks were up more than 10% in the subsequent hour. And theglobe.com went public about 2 weeks later. The NASDAQ more than doubled over the last year. At that point, it looked as though the great bull market connected to the dot-coms had just reached a natural peak and was beginning to slide down. And that fateful decision to pivot, which wasn't stupid, there were reasons to do it, that fateful decision to pivot led to the greatest melt-up of all time, whose consequences you could argue we're still dealing with. That strikes me. Eric Balkunas had this fascinating chart. Apparently, Friday saw the biggest flows into SPY.
Oh, wow.
Ever. I've tried checking it in percentage terms, and there were a few bigger days during the real hurly-burly of the GFC, but in terms of actual money, more people put money into, or more money was put into SPY on Friday than on any other day ever before. That has the signs, as somebody who has arguably been too bearish and too conservative over the years, but that instinctively bothers me.
Okay.
I mean, it might mean you should buy now on a short time period, because wouldn't it have been fantastic to own stocks through the whole of 1999 and get out in time? And lots of people will make that calculation. But in terms of what that means for the economy and the health of the financial system over the next decade, that's concerning to me.
Hey, Elena, I want to give you the last word here and talk a little bit about what the analysts and you speak to tell you in terms of their bearishness, because it's kind of hard to find the bears out there right now, isn't it?
It is kind of hard to find. We are looking at a number of sell side analysts being quite bullish on the next half a year, with a few exceptions like Mike Wilson, like a few other analysts. But what I wanted to mention is that the election year, historically, this century has so far seen some weakness in the middle of the year, in the second and third quarters of the year. We saw that in 2000. We saw that obviously in 2008. We saw quite a bit of that in 2020. Now some may argue these were exceptional periods of time, and yes, I agree with that. But if history is any indication at this point, and I don't know whether that's going to be the case, we could see some pullback, and with stocks near record, we could be live for a pullback sometime in the second and fourth quarter.
Elena Popina, equity markets reporter for Bloomberg News. John Author, senior editor for markets and a Bloomberg opinion columnist here in our Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. We're just getting started on this Monday afternoon. This is Bloomberg Business Week.
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 3:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. After a 7-week bull run, stocks continue to push higher. We've got 39 minutes to go ahead of the closing bell. S&P up 28 right now at 47.47. That is a gain of 0.6%. The Dow up 34 now, up 0.1%. NASDAQ up another 120, up 0.8%, bringing the NASDAQ Composites year-to-date gain to 42.6%. Russell 2000 swinging between gains and losses, back in the green now, little changed, up by about 0.1%. 10-year yield 3.94%, the 2-year 4.45%. Spot gold up 0.3%, 2026 on the precious metal, and West Texas Intermediate crude up 1.7%, 72.65 a barrel. Bottom line, stocks higher across the board. Lori Heinel is Global Chief Investment Officer at State Street Global Advisors, and on surveillance this morning, she told us she does have a number of concerns heading into the new year.
First and foremost, valuations have really gotten stretched here. So to envisage equities continue to go higher and higher from here seems a little bit naive from our vantage point. The second thing is that we do see the economy slowing. Here in the U.S., for example, we think growth is going to be somewhere closer to 2%, which hardly justifies the kind of levels that we see right now in stocks.
And you can hear more of that conversation on the Surveillance podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcasts. Nikola founder Trevor Milton has been ordered to spend 4 years behind bars for lying to shareholders about the electric truck maker's progress. Shares of Nikola, they are trading lower, down now by about 5.5%. Sinclair shares are higher after the Wall Street Journal said Amazon is in talks to invest in the broadcaster's bankrupt Diamond Sports Group. Sinclair up by about 1.6%. Recapping, stocks higher, S&P up 29, up 0.6%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Thank you so much for that update, Charlie Pellet. Really do appreciate it. When it comes to providing satellite internet from low Earth orbit, pretty much everyone knows about Starlink. It's the SpaceX company that for years has been launching thousands of tiny satellites into space, and that provides connectivity in deserts, war zones, oceans, kind of anywhere that people can't really get a high-speed internet connection. There's another game in town, though, and it comes from none other than Amazon. Project Kuiper, as it's called, is an enormous undertaking in an arena that has had more bankruptcies than success.